Hey, John. How are you?
Pre-event audio check. Just
Yeah, what would you like us to do, Alex?
talk about how cold it is. You like the weather?
It is so cold.
Alex.
I don't know. Just starting at the end, working down. Can I get you to say a couple words?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Mary,
sure.
just get it good at going, just say a couple words.
Sure, testing.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
10, 11, 12, 13.
It's cold outside.
Really, really cold.
Marlon's used to the cold. He was a student here.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
I love the cold. Test. Testing.
Testing, testing.
Testing. I would say for those of you sharing a mic, you can move it when you're getting ready to speak. So just maybe pick it up and put it over in front of you.
Do you have notes?
Do you guys have, or unless you guys have one person who's going to do your
Christina.
Christina? Excellent. Who's going to do your path to victory, Mike?
You want to start?
Yeah, John can do it.
John?
Yeah.
I'm ready when Lawrence is ready.
Is Lawrence ready? Okay, he says to go. All right. Wow. Good morning. We're delighted to see you for day 2 of our post-election conference. And for those of you who were here yesterday or not, I'll say welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. I am Barbara Ballard, Associate Director here at the Dole Institute, and the post-election panel will be moderated by the Dole Institute Director, Bill Lacey. Today's panel will cover the general election. You know, yesterday we talked about the primary. We will take a break for lunch around noon and reconvene at 1 p.m. For those wishing to eat here, and that's kind of unusual for us, but KU Dining will have lunch items available for purchase in the Darby Gallery that's right in front when you enter. Please plan to pay with cash. We are joined again today by over 25 students and faculty from Pittsburgh State University, Rockhurst University, Emporia State University, and Wichita State University, as well as members of our own Dole Institute Student Advisory Board. And so I would ask you to please welcome them here today. Thank you. Before we begin, just a reminder to our audience, part of the Dole Institute's mission is to promote civil discourse in politics, although you may not agree with everything you hear today. We always expect our speakers and our audience members to treat each other with civility and the utmost respect. For those of you who have attended programs here before, you know that we do not tolerate heckling, outbursts, or interruptions of any kind. If you disrupt today's panels, you will be given a warning, a nice warning. If you continue to disrupt our program, you will be asked to leave, and this will be strictly enforced. So I would ask you, please, don't disrupt. There will be a question and answer period today at the end of our panel discussion. A standing microphone will be available in the middle of the room for you. Please line up in an orderly fashion. I will be close by to assist you. And I would ask one brief question, and please don't make statements. If you have limited mobility and you wish to ask a question, please raise your hand, and one of our Student Advisory Board members will come to you, write your question, have your name on it, and I will read it for you. The last 2 items we will just discuss is, since you'll be eating and drinking at your seat, if you will just please pick up any trash around you before you leave, we would be much appreciated. So you have all the do's and the don'ts and all the warnings. Now let's go on with the second half of this program, because yesterday was spectacular. And we can have fun, you can ask your questions. So with that, I would say please welcome our panelists this morning for our session of the 2016 Post-Election Conference. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out this very brisk morning. Let me begin by saying there are full bios for all of our guest speakers that are available for you to pick up. I am not going to do any formal introduction. I'm just going to very quickly go through our guests. From my left, we have Mary Mine, Edison Research, Alex Burns, New York Times, Christina Reynolds, Jennifer Palmieri, Marlon Marshall, all from Secretary Clinton's campaign, Colleen McCain Nelson from the Wall Street Journal, soon to be, or maybe already, the Kansas City Star. To my right, Caitlin Huey-Burns from RealClearPolitics, Michael Glassner, Alan Cobb, and John McLaughlin from the Trump campaign, MJ Lee from CNN, and Sasha Issenberg from Bloomberg. Let's begin today by talking about the general election path to victory for both candidates, and for the Clinton team, Christina Reynolds. Christina, you have about 5 minutes to present the general election path to victory.
Sure. We began this campaign knowing that, first and foremost, you started with arguably two of the most well-known candidates in a general election ever. Voters knew who they were. They had strong opinions about them. And so this was less about defining the candidates and more about defining the differences. We felt like there were some very strong differences where the points that we wanted to make about Secretary Clinton were counterbalanced by the points that we wanted to make about Donald Trump. First and foremost, and as our overarching theme, the idea that she was the candidate who could bring people together to get results that mattered for Americans, versus a candidate who we viewed as unfit and unprepared to be president. We thought that was the overarching concern, and where we needed to be in an election in which Hillary Clinton could not be the candidate of change. We were in some ways running for the third term of President Obama. We were running with a candidate who obviously is incredibly well known. Her husband's been president. She was in the most recent administration. So it wasn't about change, it was about results and getting things done for people. We had three key points within that where we had points of contrast for each candidate. The first was the message that you may have heard from us quite a bit towards the end of the election. Hillary Clinton fundamentally believes that people are stronger together, that part of the job of president and part of the way we solve problems is to bring people together. We believe that contrasted very starkly with what we thought was Donald Trump's divisive view of America and divisive campaign, from the Muslim ban to the way he talked about various groups of people. We thought that created a real point of contrast. We also thought, with regard to foreign policy and more broadly our place in the world, there was a real point of contrast. This is the first time, certainly in my memory, when I can remember the Democrat having the advantage on issues like national security going into the election. Some of us found it particularly gratifying that that first time was a woman, but she certainly brought a wealth of experience from having been Secretary of State, from having been a senator on some key committees, and that experience, that understanding of foreign policy, her ability to really understand and speak about and I think make people feel like she understood the world and where we stood in it and how to solve problems, contrasted with what we called sort of the dangerous message on Donald Trump, that there was a view that he didn't have an understanding and was inexperienced around foreign policy, but also could be erratic and would talk about, we looked at things like, his often spoken of admiration of Putin versus his calling out leaders in Great Britain and in London specifically, which were major allies. We thought when you put that up against someone with the experience that she has, particularly in diplomacy, that was a real point of contrast. The final one was one on economy, and this was one in which Hillary Clinton believed, she talked about this a lot during the primary, although it certainly didn't break through compared to Senator Sanders, but the idea that she believes in an economy that works for all of us, not just those at the top, that her policies were based on making people pay their fair share, but helping out those who haven't caught a break, who are the victims of a rigged system. That contrasted with two things on an economic side from Donald Trump. One, we shorthanded it with fraud, who's in it for himself, but we believe that that had both policy and record implications. When you looked at his business record, there were things where what we thought was a record of Donald Trump getting rich, sometimes at the expense of other people, Trump University, Trump Networks, and things like that, or Donald Trump getting rich sometimes at the expense of his investors. When you look at the Atlantic City record, that was the record side. On the policy side, what we saw was, despite some really great messaging and rhetoric around it, his policies still overwhelmingly benefited the wealthy. They often benefited corporations. We thought that was a real point of contrast. And so those were the points of difference that we wanted to highlight, believing that America sort of knew and had opinions of both of these candidates. And from there, we really looked for key moments. We thought that our path to victory was having Hillary Clinton break through the media around her. We had not planned on different letters from the FBI director, but you know, there was a lot of news around things like the FBI investigation, emails, the foundation, things like that. And we thought ultimately our best messenger is an unfiltered Hillary Clinton. So things like debates we knew would be key moments for her. We also thought some of the speeches, particularly where she laid out the case against Donald Trump, contrasting with her own record, showed her as a fighter, showed her as someone who could stand up to him, and thought that that was compelling to people. It's ironic, and I'm not sure we started with a path of victory to the team that didn't win, but that was our plan going in. We thought the debates were a great moment for two reasons for us, and a great opportunity for us. First, again, it shows the candidates unfiltered. You know, obviously they're answering questions and they're going back and forth, but it's without the wrapper of someone else's views on what they're saying. And second, debates are an opportunity to show that you understand policy, that you have views and visions for America, and that's something that doesn't often break through, particularly in a media where gaffes and comments, particularly from the other side, were a lot of the press, and so having an hour and a half or 2 hours, you know, three times, for her to really be able to lay out the idea that yes, she can be president. You can see her as president. You can see that she has opinions and views on key policies. We thought would be great moments, and truthfully, I think what the numbers showed were that her positive attributes were actually increasing over the course of the debates. And so we thought those were good moments. There were some unpredictable things in this campaign, and some things that may have changed things, but that was our goal, and I'm sure Marlon can talk about this later. We obviously had political plans and plans out in the States, but in terms of how what our message was throughout the campaign, I think that was our vision.
Okay, thank you, Christina. Now to the Trump campaign, John McLaughlin.
All right, let me just frame some of this, because Mike was on board last July, right, in 2015, and I've known him for a number of years, and Corey Lewandowski was somebody that I introduced to him years ago as possibly running New Hampshire, so Corey and I had talked off and on during 2015, but I really didn't get more involved till after Wisconsin during the primaries. But during the time when he would call, because I've known him for years, and let me frame this too, everything that says this is an unconventional, different campaign, absolutely true. This was a historic race, very unique situation. You had a very successful businessman whose specialty is public relations and his brand, and he really ran his own campaign. He was a strategist. When he set the slogan, "Make America Great Again," that was him, that was his gut. And he would call on people when they needed information. And Alan was on board early on with Corey Lewandowski as well, but but I was one of 5 pollsters eventually that got involved, where I was probably the first, and where he would have us do the polling, and it was myself, Tony Fabrizio, Kellyanne Conway eventually in June, July, Mike Basilis and Adam Geller became the team. And early on though, when I was advising Mr. Trump, I was like, you realize that the other side, they have a machine. They are formidable. They have talented, some of the best strategists ever for the Democrat Party work for them. And they knew, they got President Obama elected, and Hillary Clinton, you know, she's really formidable, she's really tough. But the trends, I referred to this yesterday, there was a March National Review article we wrote based on a national survey where we said this was Trump's election to lose. It was really his to lose. And the reason was because two-thirds of the, and it was constant for like the last couple of years during the midterm elections and then throughout, two-thirds of America think the country's on the wrong track. So we could identify people that said the country's on the wrong track and weren't voting for us, and we could target them, which is hence why Mr. Trump came up with a slogan of "Make America Great Again," which seems to have resonated and brought that. And it wasn't just one specific issue area. It was security. It was the economy. It was standard of living. It was quality of life. People in their own personal situations where they felt helpless. One of the things I did prior to working for Mr. Trump, I did a project where we, when you realize fewer people voted in the presidential election in 2012 than 08. And we went and identified voters who didn't vote, but had a history of voting. And like actually, when you run the list of, if they voted in 2008, 2010, but didn't vote in 2012, in the key states, there was 500,000 in Virginia, and they were there. There was 800,000 in Ohio. There was 1 million in Florida. And they tilted towards Republicans, mainly independents, and they were moderate, but their working class voters made less than 60,000 a year. And they didn't like President Obama or his policies, but they walked away from Mitt Romney. So the Obama campaign to drive them away had worked. We had to reinvigorate them and bring them back. And one of the things that we were tracking early on, and every one of the polls for the Trump campaign had a question in it. Do you want the country to change? Do you want to continue Barack Obama's policies or change and move in a new direction? Every one of our polls had it. The first poll that he actually did was in New York. He wanted to see if we could win his home state. Hillary was under 50, but we were losing by 12, and we had negatives over 60%. But she wasn't even like there. And the pattern of things that we could see that the other side was going to run a character race. And I said to him at the time, I said, you realize this is going to be what I would call a Helms-style election. That I'd worked for Senator Helms years ago, and he always had a negative over, he was only ahead in the polls one day every 6 years. And at the election. And his negative was always over 40%. So the way he would get reelected is he would raise his opponents over 50%. And in the national polls, Donald Trump's negatives, well, Hillary had over, she was in the mid-50s, and she was running in the mid-50s nationally in the battleground states. And the only way for her to win was to raise his negatives over 60% and keep them there. So she had to run a campaign where she kept attacking his character. And we had to run a campaign where we were running about issues and messages and change. And so there was really three types of voters that we were working with, digital people and working with the other pollsters to focus in on. One, we were going to maximize the anti-Hillary vote because she was, she was never above 50 nationally. She was always, the majority of Americans wanted to vote against her. And you heard journalists talk yesterday about the race was going to be decided by people that were unfavorable to both. At times in the polls, they were 25, 30% of the entire electorate. And at times when Gary Johnson was hitting double digits, nobody knew who he was. It was just, I'm going to vote, but I don't like these other candidates. So we were going to maximize the anti-Clinton vote. But then we needed to siphon up votes from the undecideds and siphon up votes to the extent there were undecideds. Siphon up votes also from the Libertarian candidate. And then we needed to bring in these working class voters who passed on the election 4 years ago. And when you think about 4 years ago, you had a pool of 90 million eligible voters who didn't vote. And we had to find them in the key battleground states and re-engage them. And it was a bit of what I said in post-election. It was we were combining the Rust Belt with the Sun Belt again and trying to build a new GOP coalition. And in the end, besides the change question, what we had in all the polls, there was also an element of they were clearly running a campaign that he wasn't fit to be president. And that was early, very early on. You could see that in the earlier surveys. So it became our temperament versus her corruption. Because when you asked June, July, do you agree or disagree Hillary Clinton's honest? And 60%, over 60% would always say no. But it wasn't an honesty that hurt people. It had to be the corruption. Because the corruption enabled people to say, my life's not getting better, I'm paying more taxes, I can't find a job, my health care is going up. The Obamacare was a big help in the end. That was the sentiment against that. But it was the corruption was hurting us. and we needed to go in a new direction. And ultimately, the credit for this, the strategist that's not here that should take credit for this is Donald Trump. I mean, he figured this out. He basically, he is unbelievable in terms of when you give him good information, the way he proceeds, the way he does what he has to do to succeed. And I've commented after the election was over, yes, they won the popular vote, and there's big differences in states that, when you look at it, if it was a battleground state where they were fighting, I mean, Georgia had 75% turnout. There's a great website, U.S. Elections Project, where they tell you what the turnout was in each state. And you can see in the battleground states, 65, 70% turnout. In the other states, it's like 50 or whatever, because at some level, people are saying, oh, my vote doesn't count, which is too bad, because we would like them to vote and like them to count. There may have been more votes out there for us to win the popular vote. But in the battleground states, he won it. We didn't win a landslide. I mean, 3 states, when you think about it, Michigan, 10,000, Wisconsin, 22,000, Pennsylvania, just under 70,000. I mean, 100,000 votes the other way, and it would be a different story today. Because we really, at the end, I was talking to Brad Parscale over the weekend, and he sent me the analytics, and you could see the coalition that we had was coming together in the early vote, where our vote was up in places like North Carolina, where you have party registration. You could see Republicans were up, independents were up, rural voters were up, older middle-aged voters were up. African Americans were down at some point, 20% from previous totals 2 weeks out or 3 weeks out, and all of a sudden it was still 10% at the end, and you could see he was not, one of my theories on getting out the vote was Barack Obama was brilliant in terms of energizing his younger voters, the minority voters. He was a historic president, and they came out from it. I always thought Hillary Clinton, she's a formidable candidate, she's great, but she's not Barack Obama. And you can see at the margins, when you look at even the exit polls, you're saying net among African Americans, Donald Trump did 8 points better. Among Hispanics, compared to Romney in 2012, he did 8 points better. You can see in South Florida, because we poll for a lot of other clients, members of Congress and different state legislators around the country, you can see in their polls, like in South Florida, the Cuban vote was coming in for us, 80, 90% at the end. Other Hispanics, it was tougher, but you could see in Ohio when I was doing the campaigns tracking, we kept getting like 20% of the African American vote saying they were going to vote for us, and we ended up putting them together and saying, what are all these samples? And half of them were college educated, most of them were men, and they really were going to vote for Trump, and we were going to do better than Romney did, and we were going to get some of that vote, and that may be the future of the Republican Party, is getting more of the more expanding the coalition to working class African Americans and Hispanics, and Donald Trump made a beachhead and started that. So, but ultimately on election day, when I was talking to Brad Parscale, and he's saying the analytics good, I know we're going to win, I said we still got to win the turnout on Tuesday. We have to win the turnout on Tuesday. And all during the day, he was doing, Donald Trump has 16 million Facebook likes. He has 17 million Twitter followers. All during the day, he could talk to voters directly. When you have that level, you can have multiple, Barack Obama did it brilliantly 4 years ago against Romney, where even in the published polls, he only came ahead in the last weekend on the average of polls on the RealClearPolitics site. And they were able to get, 1 million people to open up their Facebook directories, because when I think about the average person on Facebook is a woman who's about 50 years old with 300 friends. My line about Facebook is, you know how somebody's at work, they're on Facebook. And
Let's move it along, John. We're running out of time.
okay, but the bottom line was Donald Trump busted his butt all through the last couple of weeks, busted his butt on election day to get the votes out, and we actually won the turnout, and we were able to, he didn't buy a landslide, but we were able to win on election day, so we were fortunate in that regard.
Yeah, thanks, John. We'll come back to that a little bit later, but I want to go back to June, and I'd like to get the non-campaign representatives, each of you, to talk a little bit about how you saw the race in June. You saw by June the 2 presumptive nominees were selected. You kind of had a sense of how the race was going to play out. How did you feel it was going to play out? Sasha?
Sure. I think that there were obviously, it seemed early in the summer, far more sort of campaigning challenges in front of Trump than it seemed to be in front of Hillary Clinton. I think that the VP selection was going to be a much bigger deal for the Trump campaign. The question of how the convention, not just how it was sort of executed, but sort of thematically how he was going to position himself sort of vis-a-vis the Republican Party with against whom he had a sort of contentious relationship throughout the primary. So I think the summer posed a lot more open questions for how the Trump campaign would sort of tie up the loose ends from the primary than for the Clinton campaign, where it seemed kind of inevitable that they would reconcile with Sanders on good terms. The only question was sort of what that looked like and what the culminating event was. And so, and I think it became pretty clear from the sort of bits of reporting about the VP selection process on the Democratic side, and everything we could tell that they did not see a need to use the VP selection to make any significant either gestures towards parts of the Democratic coalition or voters outside the Democratic coalition where they thought that they had problems, or use it to shore up an obvious vulnerability the way that Trump might.
Okay. MJ, thoughts on the election in June?
Yeah, I think one theme that was very striking, and especially the way that we saw things play out at each of the conventions. I mean, remember that even by the time that Trump had clinched the nomination, there were real sort of questions being raised and skepticism, I think, within the party itself about sort of his ability to run in the general election successfully. We saw in the convention, this was very unusual. We didn't have sort of major Republican Party leaders even in attendance or willing to speak on behalf of Donald Trump. And, at Hillary Clinton's convention, obviously, this was the opposite. We really saw the party coming together, the president, the first lady, the vice president, every sort of big Democratic leader you could think of was speaking on her behalf. So I think even heading into the summer, there were real questions about, can he really get the party on board, and can he raise serious money, the kind of money that Hillary Clinton would be able to raise to get him through the entire general election? So I think heading into the summer, there was a lot of questions being raised about, does he really have what it takes to run a successful campaign without sort of the party apparatus and the help from the party that would be so important?
Go ahead, Caitlin.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, I mean, it was just, I thought one of the most interesting stories was the idea that the Republican Party had nominated someone that they didn't want to, really. I mean, if you're thinking about the party as how you traditionally think of it. And so to those points, I think that was just kind of the biggest thing. And so I remember after Indiana wrapped up, and we were all saying, okay, wow, this is what it's going to be. The electability argument was one that was made by Kasich and Cruz and others who were competing to take Donald Trump to the convention, and so that was certainly one of the questions. And the other was, how would this candidate, transition into the general election where we thought it would be a very different electorate. And we saw over and over again that, there was always talk of the pivot, right? And that was, the phrase I never want to hear again after this election. But it was used over and over again, how is he going to transition, how is he going to transition? And it just, he kind of kept the same kinds of themes throughout. And so the Republican unity question was one that existed, really up until the final weeks of the campaign. I mean, obviously with the news of the Access Hollywood tape and all of that, you saw the party, exit. And so I think that was one of the biggest themes throughout till the final days.
Okay. Colleen?
Well, I think in June, the race looked very different than it ultimately did. There were a lot of ominous signs for Donald Trump in June. It was around that time that he was kind of creating what seemed like a lot of needless controversies. Kind of, he was attacking the Judge Curiel. He was saying things that to many people seemed just both offensive and also unnecessary. Why is he creating these controversies? And he was having trouble locking down support from some members of his own party. We were seeing some GOP defections. It was unclear whether he could really unify his party. And on the other side, in June, Hillary Clinton was working to get Sanders' endorsement. She was unifying the Democratic Party. She was kind of bringing Sanders supporters into the fold. And so you saw a very strong contrast between where the Democrats were and where the Republicans were at that point. And it was also around the same time that I think you kind of saw the Clinton strategy really kind of crystallize in terms of how you run against Donald Trump. And it was in early summer that Hillary Clinton gave her major foreign policy speech where she really used Donald Trump's own words to great effect against him and repeated back many of the things that Donald Trump had said about foreign policy and saying that he knows more about ISIS than the generals. And I think a lot of Democrats in that moment said, yes, this is how you run against Donald Trump. This is what the Republicans failed to do. And so in that moment, it seemed that the Clinton team had kind of hit upon an effective strategy for running against Donald Trump, and I think a lot of Democrats felt pretty good at that moment.
Okay, Alex?
I guess I would sort of stress the degree to which the view in June was pretty consistent, I think, between the campaigns and across the campaigns and the media. That certainly my own view, I think the consensus view in the press was that Trump had clearly been a more formidable candidate in the primary than anyone expected, but that if you looked at the public polls, it's extremely unusual to think that someone could win an election despite being seen as racist, unqualified for the office, lacking the temperament to do the job. And the Trump campaign saw things the same way. We reported in August that there was a meeting with Trump and the high command of his campaign in June where they confronted him with polling information showing that when people were asked an open-ended question, what do you think of Donald Trump, that the two words that were offered most frequently were a liar and racist. And I think that at that point, those seemed like they would be the controlling judgments in the election unless Trump changed something in the fundamentals. And I can't count how many times over the next few months I wrote that he needed to change the fundamentals of the campaign. I don't know that he ever did, but I do want to commend John really for his candor in talking about the need to sort of work around the obstacles that were obviously there in the electorate and the narrowness of the ultimate win. But when I look back at what we thought in June and how it turned out and what we got wrong, it wasn't so much that we misjudged the way voters saw Trump or the way Trump was handling the campaign or the value of what the Clinton campaign was doing. We did significantly, the view in June that you cannot win an election if you are seen this way by a clear majority of the country, sort of no matter what else you do. That looks really different now.
Okay, Mary?
Sure. So one of the things that we were doing was we were measuring in the year before the election all Americans' economic anxiety and how they were feeling about the economy. And so we began the survey in the fall of 2015, and we conducted one in May of 2016. And we had seen Americans' economic anxiety increase over that period of time, even though the economy was improving and the unemployment rate was going down and things were looking fine. There's really no economic data reason why people would be feeling more anxious that we could point to, but people were feeling more anxious. And so even though at that point in the campaign in May and June, Trump was coming out of the primaries sort of embattled, and it was unclear whether he was going to pivot or how he was going to play in the general election, a lot of his ideas had taken hold in the American public's eye. We found in our survey in May that 71% of Americans think that the economic system is rigged in favor of the wealthy. And so, clearly, and that part of that comes from Bernie Sanders was making that argument too. So in this moment, sort of after the primaries, the Trump's message and Bernie Sanders' message, and also, to a certain extent, Hillary Clinton's message were coming through, and that Americans were feeling like the economic system was rigged, and also the idea that that trade was taking jobs away from Americans, and so throughout the campaign, the economy was the ultimate issue, and I think we saw it all throughout the campaign, but particularly at that moment in the summer, or the early summer, the economy was the issue to be watched. And what both candidates were talking about was the need to add good jobs. And we found that almost 2/3 of Americans said that they could not, that it was difficult to find good jobs where they live. And so both campaigns were talking about good jobs, and I think that was a key point and a key issue for them to be communicating about. And that was going to be what the American public was looking at.
One of the big themes of recent presidential elections has been money, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that briefly. If we could start, I'd love the Clinton team to talk about how you guys went about, I realize none of you were directly involved in fundraising, but you're aware of it, how you went about raising the money and obtaining the advantage you have. Then get a reaction from the Trump team of how much did that concern you and what action did you take after securing the nomination. And then get any other comments from the panel about just kind of the importance of money in this particular election.
Thanks, Bill. Hey, everybody. We had kind of a two-pronged track in terms of fundraising. First was major donors. The Clintons had an extensive network that they built over a large amount of time, and really tapping into those networks to raise funds so we could be able to run a field program across. We had staff in all 50 states, be able to do the television, be able to do everything that we needed to do to execute a campaign was important.
Excuse me, Marlon, speak directly into the mic.
Sorry.
I don't think everybody can hear you real well.
You want me to start over?
No.
Okay, cool. And then, so there was a major donor piece, and then low dollar donations online was a really big part of our campaign. The major donor really kind of got us started, so that way we can continue to cultivate our list building throughout the entire campaign, starting in the primary, then moving into the general election. And as we kept moving forward in the general election, you saw our low dollar fundraising continue to grow and grow and grow as more people came involved. And we talked about this a little bit yesterday in the primary, but in the general election, we definitely used moments throughout the campaign to try to build our list. So debates, huge moments for us to be able to do everything we can to get people to come to our website, sign up, and that way we can cultivate a relationship with those folks. We would have debate watch parties across the country, and at those times we would sign people up also there so that way they could be a low dollar donor. The events that we did, whether we have rallies or house meetings or whatever, signing people up so we can reach back out to them to volunteer, but also cultivate that low dollar donation relationship with them. So I think the majority of our funds probably came in through major donor, but that low dollar donation, as you kept going closer and closer to general election, slowly started to catch up with our major dollar fundraising, and both of those things were necessary to be able to run the campaign we need to run.
Okay, Mike, do you want to comment about the Trump campaign's concern or whatever you guys felt about the disadvantage you had, and what action, if any, you took to address that?
I'd be happy to do that. So I mentioned, yesterday in my discussion, we did talk about the overwhelming advantage that some of the other candidates, particularly Bush, had in the primaries with his fundraising machine, and how that turned out to be, an almost negligible factor in his ability to, wage an effective primary campaign. So throughout the primaries, Mr. Trump largely self-funded his campaign. We did raise small donors online to a minimum degree. We raised a lot of money selling hats, right? So it was largely, most of our, the primary campaign was funded through, sales of hats and other collateral material online. But one of the things we realized when we realized we had this ability to build these giant rallies even as early as the summer of 2015, was that we captured the data of all the people who registered to attend the event. So it wasn't, and in many cases we would experience a 50% attrition rate in the rallies. So we would stage a rally for 10 or 15 or 20,000 people, yet we would capture the data from 50,000 or 70,000 people. So we knew that we had this giant trove of data that had the potential to be an enormous small dollar fundraising base that we never exploited in the primaries. But I had always made the presumption, and I had talked about it a lot internally, that was sort of the untapped resources that nobody really knew how effective it was going to be as a donor base. We knew they were supporters, obviously, but somebody filling out a form with their email is different than giving money. So one of the techniques of the strategy we had for the general was to enter into a joint fundraising agreement with the Republican National Committee, which is standard practice for both parties. But we knew that we would be relying on that arrangement much more heavily than previous nominees had done, because we had not developed a high donor base. So in the primary, that was a tremendous advantage because we spent 0 time raising money, which gave us a huge advantage over our primary rivals because we could campaign a lot more and do a lot of other things while they were doing that with the majority of their time, I presume. So in the general, we entered into this agreement with the RNC to have a joint fundraising committee where we had large donors, and then part of the money was attributed to the campaign itself. Then we had a small dollar donor program that went through the party, and the campaign itself had a small dollar program that was largely done online and through email and other means. So what in fact we had presumed in the primary turned out to be true by a mind-boggling rate in the general, in that this army of people who many of whom we had assembled in the primary through our rallies and other means of collecting data, turned out to be a very, very stable and reliable fundraising base for small donors. So we knew all the way through from the primary to the general that we would be overmatched in fundraising. We were continuously throughout, but we also knew that we also knew after the first month that we would be able to have enough money generated by this small donor base that it was really part of a grassroots movement, which ultimately was successful. And so that gave us a lot more flexibility, and we knew that we had a base of donors that we could depend on throughout the general, and it turned out to be true, and it was quite effective. We didn't have as much money as our opponents did, but obviously it turned out not to matter in the end, as it had not mattered in the primaries.
Any other thoughts on the importance of money in this cycle from any of our non-campaign reps?
Yeah, to go from raising money to spending money, I think to some extent, I'm interested in hearing from Marlon at some point on this, and I think it became more of an issue, especially in October, as there was fluidity in the map and campaigns were making decisions about resources in the battleground states. The asymmetry of spending of money between the campaigns, I think, made it very difficult for the Clinton campaign and the super PACs, especially priorities that were spending money on their behalf, to assess the Trump campaign's battleground state priorities, because advertising was at such a disproportionate level until the last 2 or 3 weeks of the campaign. And usually usually the way that campaigns, you look back at 2012, the Obama and Romney campaigns were basically evenly matched by the end in the amount of money that was being spent when you added the campaigns and the super PACs and parties together. And they were spending in largely comparable ways. And so there's a very good indication of, you can basically rationally interpret what your opponent's battleground strategy is based on where they're spending on TV and putting resources on the ground. You can kind of see what their priorities are and effectively reverse engineer what you think their polling or analytics are telling them about how competitive they are in places. And often this plays out kind of like a Cold War simulation where you can game out in a war game what your opponent is likely seeing and going to do. The fact is that the Trump campaign was not, they put a disproportionate amount of their media spending digitally, which is totally opaque. You can see a television ad when it's placed, how much money, what show it went on. You can which markets it was in, basically interpret who they were trying to communicate with. Digital advertising, which overwhelmingly until the fall was focused on fundraising and list acquisition, not on persuasion or mobilization, is basically impossible to track in a similar way. And because the Trump campaign was disproportionately reliant on state parties and the RNC to run their field program, there's huge disparities state to state over their staffing levels and the number of offices, and most of those decisions were made by the imperatives of state parties. So, Wisconsin was a state that was staffed up very early at a high level from a field perspective on the Republican side. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that you had an RNC chairman and a Governor, Scott Walker, who has a lot of influence and interest in the state parties, and an incumbent Republican Senator Ron Johnson, who was in a tough race. Not necessarily, and I think it's very hard for the Clinton campaign to look at, oh, they are putting a bunch of resources into Wisconsin. What does that tell us? And so, I think that it was you could not look at this as a sort of Cold War simulation where you had an idea of where their missiles were aimed and assume that if you do X, they'll do Y in response. And I think that it made it very difficult for you guys to interpret rationally what they were up to, what they were seeing.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this topic? Marlon, did you want to address that?
I agree. No, I think by the end, and I'm interested to actually hear from them on this, there was two things that somewhat kind of played out that we saw in terms of where they were really targeting, because it didn't seem, for a while, it didn't seem to be television advertising, because they'd buy in certain states and all of a sudden they'd be down and they'd be like, what, are they in Virginia, are they not, what's going on? I think travel schedule by the end somewhat dictated it. It took a little bit, but you started to see some of the repetition of where they were going. They lived in Ohio for a while, and then started, getting to the Michigans, Pennsylvanias, et cetera. And then, I remember we talked about this a little bit, but they did a lot of satellite with, I know Mr. Trump himself, but also a lot of surrogates into those niche markets in Ohio, in the Michigans, in the Midwest, in the Rust Belt. A lot of satellite television. So I think they were creating a lot of earned media that we were able to see, and you kind of put some of the puzzle pieces together. But you're right, in terms of traditional, like, oh, they're going up on this TV, so we got to match them here, and this, that, and the other. This was not your type of election to do that.
Okay.
Bill, I might just address something real quick. The question was, were we worried or concerns? I was never worried. I thought if we're going to lose, it's not going to be because we're not as on TV as much. I think the electorate has changed. As Christina mentioned, you have two ubiquitously known candidates. I don't know how many people in this room made their decision based on a television ad. So that never concerned me. I've always confident we had enough money, we were going to raise enough money for the reasons Michael mentioned to get done what we needed to get done, and it was not going to be through television advertising.
Okay. I want to ask Team Clinton, what was the level of relief with the Comey announcement in the summer that there would be no further action taken on the email? And did you think you had put that behind you at that point?
Is this okay? Can you guys hear me? Okay. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, okay. So that, the first Comey announcement happened in July, and we were surprised by it because Hillary had done her interview with the FBI on Saturday, and this was Tuesday, the day after the 4th of July. And we didn't have a heads up about it, which is not unusual, that this is what Comey was going to do. It is unusual. It was not just unusual, unprecedented that Comey actually did a press conference where he announced that they were not moving forward with any case against her. What I was relieved that it happened then, because my concern had been, and having worked in the Obama administration and the Clinton administration, that I know that at some point when the Department of Justice is looking into a matter and it's involving a candidate, I know at some point they determine we're too close to the election to weigh in on this one way or the other, and we're going to punt it until after the election, which I feared that we were getting close to that part, to that where they may make that kind of decision. I think it's very hard for voters to understand that, because that seems very counter to how you would want this to get resolved. The idea that you would wait until after the election to resolve an investigation would seem odd. And so but I was concerned we were entering in that. Also, we were 3 weeks away from our own convention, and my concern had been, since she had not gotten a call from the FBI that they were going to not do the interview until after the convention, and then we would have a good convention, but it would get upended by whatever coverage there was coming out from this interview that she did. So we were glad that it happened early. In watching it unfold, the actual press conference, he was so critical of her, I assumed that he was building to, I still believe he was building to not moving forward with the case, but understood that the FBI director standing there being critical of her was likely to be very damaging to us. So I was grateful that it happened, like a lot of things in this campaign and in this cycle and on our campaign, it was a positive development, but was grateful that we had 3 weeks from the time that happened to when the convention was, because I thought, all right, we will have this time to sort of cycle through all the coverage of it and then get to the convention fresh and have put this matter behind us. And I hadn't expected that we would go into the convention in that position.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that announcement from anybody?
Yeah, I would just jump in and say, one of the things that, from the media standpoint, really puzzled us about the Trump campaign's approach to the general election, not just the campaign, but affiliated super PACs, was that we kept expecting, and one of my colleagues and I talked about this like every other day, like, where's the Comey ad? Like, where is the ad that's just 60 seconds of Jim Comey saying back at the beginning of the summer, extremely careless, extremely careless, extremely careless. We thought this was just like Trump letting the pitch sail by. And I think under slightly different circumstances, if you change 100,000 votes in a couple states, that would have been like really puzzling. Why wasn't that on the air? That sort of let Comey, not the email issue obviously, but Comey himself sort of recede in the general election. FBI director is a formidable person in American life historically. Comey obviously took care of this himself in October by sort of reinserting himself into the political process. But we thought that would be a much bigger component of the message, that specific announcement at the beginning of the summer.
I might just address that particular point, is that I think that, as it had been through the primary, Trump himself was the messenger, right? He drove the communications. He drove the messaging. It was all, John referred this to earlier. It's really he was the chief strategist. So I think if you're sort of discounting the impact that was made by his public statements at his rallies that was covered widely on an ongoing basis. He brought this up as an issue continuously and would, quoting, certain segments of what the FBI director had said. So, again, I don't mean to be trite, but the fact that a 30 or 60-second ad is what's required for a message to penetrate, I think, is an antiquated concept, and that there's many, many other ways that we were able to drive a messaging other than, buying TV, which we didn't do that much of in the general or the primary.
Okay.
One quick thing.
Go ahead, Alan.
I believe President Obama did not begin campaigning with Hillary Clinton until after that Comey announcement. So clearly, that was a
It was the
positive.
same day.
Same day.
Yeah. Back to my point about, we can't have nice things.
Speaking to your mic, please, Jennifer.
That's my point.
Thank
We can't
you.
have nice things on the Clinton campaign. The day that the president was, the first day he was campaigning with us was the day of the Comey announcement. So it got washed out by the POTUS. No, we didn't.
He was
It was
scheduled to
Biden.
do.
No, it was Biden that got postponed. But we went ahead and did it. We were in North Carolina, and so we didn't get any coverage out of it, but it was already. The White House also did not, nor they did not have a heads up about his decision, which is also in keeping with normal practice.
But we were scheduled to campaign with the president, I believe, the week before, right, in Wisconsin, and it got canceled because of a hurricane, I think, or something.
Yeah.
So it wasn't the White House was avoiding the Comey decision. I think we all were concerned,
they
as were
thought-
they, that this could go on forever. So they just needed to do it.
Well, I've been doing this for 10 years, and I find every year I have all these questions I want to ask, and the discussion is so compelling. I never get to all of them. So I'm going to try to keep moving this along a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about the vice presidential selections. I'd like to start with the Trump campaign, talking about the selection of Governor Pence, then have the Clinton campaign address the selection of Senator Kaine, and then get reactions from other members of the panel. And I'd like to do this very briefly.
Yeah, I can just speak briefly to the Pence selection. So I think it was interesting. We knew that, and Mr. Trump himself, I think, knew that, to have somebody who understood Washington and knew how Congress worked would be a great advantage to him, having, running as an outsider and as a businessman who hadn't been in politics as a candidate. So obviously, Governor Pence's conservatism, and his, record as a conservative was appealing to the party base, and we knew that it would go over well at the convention, when he was brought out. But again, this whole campaign was a series of events that were, unanticipated by anyone, and one of them was sort of how it played out with meeting with the Pence and the Pence family. It so happened that Mr. Trump flew to Indianapolis to meet with the governor, and the plane broke. So we had to stay in Indianapolis overnight, an extra night that we had not anticipated. And because of that, we scheduled a second round of meetings with Governor Pence and his family the next morning, and Mr. Trump's children were there for that. So I think it was just happenstance that he spent more time with the Governor Pence than was anticipated. So I think that gave him an advantage too, because there was the dynamic of the Pence family as a very close, unit, and so was the Trump family with his children. So I think that had a major impact on it. But I think it was also, the chemistry between the two was excellent from the beginning. I think that made a significant difference. And I think that, he recognized then, just as he recognized now, that, in order to unite the party around his candidacy and now around his presidency, he had to include some figures from the, so-called establishment, like Governor Pence, like Reince Priebus now as chief of staff. So I think there were a lot of factors that worked, in Governor Pence's favor, but I think it was really their personal chemistry and the emphasis on, the family values that they had shared, I think and the timing, obviously, was very significant.
Clinton team?
I'll do the ready-made. I think there's a view that because of a particularly ridiculous WikiLeaks email from a donor in 2015 that said she's decided that it's Tim Kaine, that people thought that we decided Tim Kaine very early on. But she ultimately landed on Senator Kaine, I think, because she felt that he would be a good governing partner, but also just rounded. You want a ticket to round out, you want your running mate to round out the ticket well, and felt that Senator Kaine, as somebody who was a lifelong progressive, somebody who had always been in public service, whether that was in government or in nonprofits, work he was a civil rights lawyer early on in his career, and somebody who just really believed in the power of pointing government in the right direction to be able to make a difference for people. And she undertook this process really seriously. We had dozens of people on the original list to consider. She really didn't know Tim Kaine that well because they hadn't actually served together. He was not in the Senate when she was in the Senate. So we campaigned with him once. Family spent some time together along the lines that Michael described with the Trumps and the Pences, and I think that was an important afternoon that the Clintons and the Kaines spent together, and we felt it was interesting for us to watch because it was the first time that she'd run for president before. She'd been involved in campaigns a lot, obviously with her husband, with the president, watching President Obama's reelect as member of his cabinet. But for a woman to pick a man to be her number two, we also knew it was going to be an interesting thing for America to see for the first time, and that could be a difficult position for the man to be in. And felt that he was somebody who was incredibly supportive of her, but a very strong politician and campaigner in his own right. And it was a hard decision for her to make, but she was really, really pleased with it once we were done.
Can I just add something to that? as someone who spent a lot of time thinking about our opponent, I also think, and I think that first event that they did together, to me, was one of my favorite events of the campaign, both because you had someone who, who validated her in a way, not that she has these credentials, she has this experience, her record is clear, but she's been painted with a certain brush to all of America, and to have someone say these things about her was helpful, but also Tim Kaine is an attack dog. He's a different kind of attack dog, but we had seen throughout the campaign him do a really effective job of laying out some of the arguments against Donald Trump, and I think people viewed him as that was one of the negatives on him, and the truth is, I think a lot of us thought that America was sort of ready for someone who made these attacks in a way that sounded reasonable. It sounded the way you'd have the conversation over a dinner table, as opposed to someone sort of shouting into the TV, which is what I think people think of political attack dogs as, and I thought he did that very well, and that's something that he did, I thought, to great effect over the course of the campaign.
How much, if any, pushback did you guys get from the more progressive elements in the party on the senator?
We late in the process were concerned about that, but I think, and at one point when it was clear that this was what she was likely going to decide, although hadn't made the final decision, I pulled some of the people who worked for Tim Kaine that were on our campaign into a room and said, okay, you guys love him so much, just tell me everything about, because I had a lot on paper about him, but I couldn't get the texture of the man, really, and why people were so committed to him. And they just like deluge came out of their mouths of, everything from starting, housing discrimination suits as a civil rights lawyer, as a young man, to just, always being motivated from the time he chose to do humanitarian work in Honduras, his family, his marriage, just the kind of boss that he is. And it was clear that what emerged is this man has just lived the life of a progressive from every decision that he has made. And I was like, we are going to be able to tell this story, even if it doesn't fall into the silos of how Washington likes to look at a candidate's record. And we had a couple of, the first 36 hours, some progressives who raised some concerns, but it was just so clear that this is someone who's just really walked the walk their whole life, that we were going to be able to tell the right story about him, and I'm pleased that we were.
Yeah. Okay. Reactions to the two selections, Mary?
So interestingly, there's always a ton of anticipation about who the vice presidential picks are going to be, but it almost seemed like it was met with almost like a collective shrug. Like it didn't move the needle a whole lot on both sides. I mean, it was very interesting. People were very anxious to see who Donald Trump was going to pick, because it would reflect, is he going to pick someone establishment? Is he going to pick someone from a swing state? But I think there was a lot more anticipation of the conventions, because that was where we were going to get a chance to see, Donald Trump is he going to look presidential? And then the Democratic convention would be after that, and it would be sort of a response to that. And would we see any divide left over from the Democratic primary campaign in that? And so it was interesting to me. Of course, we're always interested, and the media is interested to see who the vice presidential picks are. But this time it seemed that the anticipation was almost more for the conventions, to see how the candidates would act and how they would look, as opposed to necessarily who they were going to choose as their vice presidential candidates.
And I think a lot of that is that the campaigns were both of them equally, I think, were more public about the kind of tryouts, and, there's no subterfuge this time about, not only did Kaine, but you did an event with Warren, Cory Booker did an event right during that, and there was no effort to discourage people in the press, I think, from reading these as auditions. And the same thing with Gingrich did an event. I mean, you sort of went through, so I think there was this kind of...
Yeah, there's no fourth wall anymore.
Yeah.
Right? There's not any way of, there's nothing there's no backstage, so...
Well, I think part of that, though, is that everybody knew that this was going to be about the two personalities at the top of the ticket, both positively and negatively, there was, I think, a lot less expectation that the campaigns needed to make a splash with their picks, or that they actually wanted to define themselves. You guys were happy for Tim Kaine to be the focus of attention for a day and then move back to talking about Donald Trump, and I think, vice versa there. And so I think it's just really unusual that I think the campaigns made these non-events by basically, it was one of the few times Trump sort of played out a little bit of what we're seeing now with the Secretary of State guessing game, but there wasn't the usual tension and suspense that the campaigns introduce around these events, and that's part of why after the fact there hasn't been there were all those reconstruction stories about in 2012 about how Paul Ryan snuck over the back wall of his home and how Sarah Palin's plane got traced to Columbus. There was no question afterwards about how did this thing come together, because there was no suspense built up going into it.
I think there was also just a really interesting contrast in ultimately the partners that both Trump and Clinton ended up choosing. I think for Trump, it was almost, picking the partner that would fill out sort of the ticket and the qualities that Trump himself did not have. So this is a guy who just in all the conventional ways appeared more presidential, just in his personality, was known to be just more sort of calm and steady. I think, it was clear that of all the short list of people that Trump was considering, I think he ended up going with the person that would help him with the sort of the weaknesses, I think, that people perceived as Trump having, whereas I think for Hillary Clinton, choosing Tim Kaine, was made clear to us that she was choosing the person that she sort of felt the most comfortable with, but more importantly, sort of helped to affirm the things that I think defined her as a public figure. In sort of the same ways, they had, a lot of sort of public service backgrounds. I think in personalities, they were compared as just having a lot of this, similar qualities. And I remember being at the first rally that they had together that Christina was talking about. And it was very, very clear that she had this spring in her step that made it, I think, clear to us that she was very, very comfortable and, at peace with the decision that she had made and with this partner that she was going to, finish out this journey with. And I think that was, very perceptible to us.
Okay, I want to get one more subject done before we take our session break this morning, and that's the convention. And I want to do this in essentially three parts. I'd like to hear from the Trump campaign on what you guys felt you needed to get out of the convention, and if you succeeded, and also what about the challenge of doing a convention that was really focused on the Trump family rather than some establishment Republican figures. Secondly, hear from the Clinton campaign about what you guys wanted to accomplish with your convention and whether you succeeded. And finally, from everybody else on the panel, their assessments of the conventions.
I could speak to I think that, the plan for the Trump campaign for the convention. Bill, you mentioned the lack of, establishment figures and political figures are, willing to show up, including the governor of the state that we are in. So, my mic just stopped.
Did you turn on? Did you snap it off accidentally?
Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay,
Good.
sorry about that.
Talk directly into it.
Okay.
Try not
so
to
when I
destroy
think,
my equipment.
I'll try to. I don't know much about microphones. So, and so, Mr. Trump's status, too, as an outsider, a businessman, obviously he was very well known by that point, but, his family was less so. And so I think the opportunity to use the convention as a showcase for a lot of his friends and family sort of reinforced his message as an outsider or somebody who was different, who was not a politician, didn't have to rely on the political structure of the party or anyone else to accomplish what he wanted to do. So, I think another part of it that there was a significant attempt, he had a long 14 years as on The Apprentice, which are very highly rated during different periods of time. And his knowledge of, and his understanding that the conventions had become nothing more than, television shows was also had a significant impact on how we produced the event and how it, played out on television. I think that, the production values were extremely high, and I think that was a reflection of that, his understanding and knowledge of the medium. So I think that it also, Mike Pence was not, particularly well-known prior to that time on the national scale. So I think that his exposure at the convention was a very, very important part of, presenting a unified ticket and a party that, was solidly behind the nominee. The other thing about the convention that was interesting was there was still a lingering and a very significant push by some in the party. The Never Trump movement had tried to agitate at some levels in the platform committee hearings and other committee meetings the week prior to the convention. And there was still some drama over whether they would, stage a vote on the floor, there'd be some protest. So I think that, again, that we knew the convention was an opportunity to show unity of the party behind this ticket. I think that you saw that develop over the week, the days of the convention. By, Thursday, I think it was very, very strong messaging coming out of there about unity behind the nominee. So I think it worked very effectively in that for what we needed to get out of the convention. I just mentioned one thing that MJ mentioned about some major political figures, in particular previous nominees. There was one that came to the convention, Bob Dole, who's a party man through and through. He's loyal to the GOP, and I think that was demonstrated there. I'm sure, there were a lot of people that didn't think that was, smart or the right thing to do, but he obviously did. He's a very loyal person. He was a strong supporter of, Mr. Trump once he got to nominee, and I think his presence at the convention was very, very significant for many people, myself included, but to the Trump family, to Mike Pence, to a lot of people, because it showed that there was a tradition of the party that was being acknowledged at the convention. Bob Dole personified that, and I think that's a very powerful message on the first night of the convention, that he was there. So again, on behalf of the Trump family and the campaign, we were very, very grateful for his demonstration of loyalty to the party and to the ticket there, and it was very significant at the time.
I had hoped to ask Jeff Rowe about this yesterday, and I just ran out of time, but were you guys, how shocked were you by Senator Cruz's non-endorsement?
Very. Although it was known, obviously we knew he was going to speak, but his failure to, endorse the nominee was, I think, surprising. And you saw that, again, this Trump, the showman, sort of took advantage of that moment, if you recall. But he came, while Senator Cruz was still speaking, Mr. Trump entered the hall at the back and sort of pulled the spotlight off of Cruz onto himself, and I think had a, significant impact on that moment that wasn't good for Cruz. But I think that was surprising.
Two quick things. It was astonishing to be there in person watching it, and you're wondering if is he going to endorse, and oh my goodness, he's not. The boos start raining down. Historical. I want to mention one other thing. The week leading up to the convention, where you do all the nitty-gritty delegate work and platform and rules that Michael addressed, I think that was important to us because we forged the Trump campaign some really deep bonds with a lot of the RNC folks and volunteers because we worked hand in glove on the platform and on the rules committee, and I think those relationships that were built during the convention were a big part of the success going on through the next several months.
Okay. I think it's safe to say that the Democratic convention was a bit more conventional or traditional than the Republican convention. How did you guys feel that it went, and did you accomplish what you needed to do? And on the other hand, what was your reaction to what was going on with Senator Cruz and some of the other things at the Republican convention?
Well, we had a couple of concerns that we had were we thought that Donald Trump is very good at television, that he was going to make a very compelling convention, and that it would be a very good show. So, and Hillary Clinton would have been a great president, but we're not as entertaining. And so we knew we were concerned about that, and that our convention would seem conventional. And I felt good going into the planning of it. I thought we'd get out the end of the week, and the press, public reaction would be like, oh, that was a good convention. But that it probably would exceed expectations, but it ended up being wildly successful in our view, and I think that's partly just because of the power of the speakers that we had, both famous people like our president and then surprises like Mr. Khan. what we had wanted to do going in, we were very concerned. We were concerned about that Trump would have a very entertaining and successful convention that way. It ended up to be not as, we did not, in the end, view it as a success. It seemed to, the improvisation, which largely is his strength, I thought that it didn't hold up at the convention. It looked, it was hard to sustain for 4 days improvisation as a strength, as opposed to just him not having a lot of support within his own party. And then the cruise thing, that I knew that would be that could be of value to us because it's a rupture in the Republican Party. But I also knew that it's something that Trump's supporters would embrace, right? This is the whole, he's a maverick, he's not of the Republican establishment. So wasn't sure that, even though it was often true in our campaign that there were things that were helpful for us because they put Trump in a bad light with some supporters of ours. But I also understood they could be helpful to Trump, right? These things could coexist. And that's how we saw Cruz. We were really worried in our campaign about what was going to happen at our convention with Sanders supporters. And, if Marlon can speak to that, but we had a remarkable, and it was a raucous first day for sure, but we had a remarkable operation with the Sanders campaign to resolve that, and thought we ended up in a very good place. But we wanted to tell the story of Hillary Clinton, which it's ironic because she has such a long-time presence in the public eye, but be able to tell the story of her life unfiltered, and thought we had a lot of success with that. Actually, I thought her husband's speech about her was one of his favorite speeches I've ever heard him deliver, very touching. And none of us on the Hillary side really saw it ahead of time, because in traditional Bill Clinton, way, it was working, writing it in long form, and when he started off saying, in 1968, I, saw her in class, I was like, wow, that's what you're going to do. This is going to be really great. And then we felt that the voices that we lifted up of just, unknown Americans, which sometimes doesn't work on television, it can come across as cloying even, really had a lot of power. And it felt, coming out of there, we felt not that we just told a good story about Hillary Clinton, but we had given Americans that were just concerned, a reason to understand they need to be concerned about their country, and that their voice can matter in this campaign, and got a real boost, and we're very pleased with it.
Okay, go ahead, Marlon.
I also felt our convention looked like America, and the diversity of speakers that we had, African American, Latino, Caucasian, Muslim, Asian American, like it just looked and felt like what the country as a whole looks like, was intentional from our end to make sure that we represented what the country looked like and told her story in that light. And so I think that after we got through the first day, and the First Lady really kind of, knocked it out the park that first day, to be able to do that each day, I thought was a success on our end.
Okay, reactions to the conventions from others on the panel? Caitlin?
I was going to say, traveling from Cleveland to Philadelphia was as if we were traveling from, one universe to the other. And I think that ended up being really the story of the campaign in the end. The Republican convention thematically had some very, dark themes. The state of the American economy, the state of national security, and coming away from that, especially Trump's address at the end, wasn't this kind of uplifting moment. It was very, very dark in that way. The Clinton convention was a different story. I think we all wrote some kind of version of A Tale of Two Conventions, and I think that was really true. And coming away from, I think there was some concern about whether, given the positivity of what a lot of Democrats were saying, whether they're overlooking some of these economic and national security anxieties. So, but you know, conventions are about those days, but also the days afterwards, and kind of capitalizing on that. And so after the Democratic convention and then the con controversy that came out, you know, it was one of those things that it was totally unconventional in terms of the way in which you capitalize on that time. So just the two universes, I think, ended up really describing the campaign in the end.
Okay, Colleen?
Just to add to that, I mean, I think the conventions were just yet another example of things that worked in past campaigns didn't prove to be the difference in this campaign. And so, I mean, the Democrats did a lot of, as Jen said, conventional things that should have been effective. And I mean, they had an all-star lineup of the president, they had the first lady, they had Biden, they had Sanders, they had Warren, they had celebrities. I mean, they had so many folks coming out and attesting to Hillary Clinton's qualifications. And on the other side, you had Trump and largely his family, and the absence, despite Senator Dole's presence, the absence of other top Republicans was very notable. And in the end, it didn't matter. And as Caitlin said, the themes in the Republican convention were very dark. And I think a lot of conventional wisdom will suggest that an optimistic message will be more effective, and the candidate who puts forth a positive vision will do better. And Hillary Clinton really seized upon a lot of what Trump said in that convention and used it day after day on the campaign trail, and said, and she mocked Donald Trump, saying, "I'm the only person who can fix it." She said, "America's already great." She really criticized kind of this dystopian construct that Trump used in the convention, and I think the Clinton team thought that was working, and in the end, it seemed that the negative message from Trump resonated with a lot of people. I think a lot of voters who supported Trump did see America as a dark place, and so even though the storyline was that this was not necessarily a particularly successful Republican convention, I think perhaps a lot of people misread Donald Trump's statements and their impact.
So I would just add that we did, we did testing of Donald Trump's closing speech at the convention, and it tested very well. And it was and we did, and we understand, so it's not as if we didn't go into the post-convention phase where Hillary embraced the contrast of him saying, "I alone can fix this," versus Stronger Together. We went into that eyes wide open. Like, there are a lot of people, and it's, I think everybody at the table would agree that that's a sad state of affairs for our country, that that is where a lot of people are. But, that was a powerful speech, and it was dark, and there were a lot of people that identified with it. But we weren't running to convince Trump supporters to be for us. We were running, we were trying to convince the people that hadn't made up their minds. So the other thing that Donald Trump said that also tested really well, we saw, was his last answer at the third debate. And after the third debate, that's when you guys really started to close on us. And it was similar themes as that convention speech, and that's just where a lot of Americans are.
I mean,
Go ahead, Sasha. Very quickly.
One thing that happened at the convention, and the fallout afterwards from the con thing rolling out, ended up being foreshadowing what a lot of the fall ended up being dominated with day to day, which were basically these feuds between Donald Trump and
We'll come back to that later,
people.
Sasha.
But it must have been the first time that the Clinton folks realized the possibility that you did not need to have somebody, the Democratic nominee or vice presidential nominee, or somebody who's sort of punching at parity against Trump, but that he would engage, he would punch down, and that could drive stories, and that she did not need to be the protagonist of
I would
every
actually
battle.
argue we first saw that when Elizabeth Warren went on a bit of a tweet storm in the fall of 2015, and he responded to her. We had a sense that he would, I hate to use this term, but punch down. But it was, the question was, when do you want your candidate in the news? I mean, we can talk about this, I suspect, over the course of this. But when do you want your candidate to actually be in the news? And what we discovered was, often if we wanted her in the news, it had to be about Trump.
Okay, Alex, you get the last word on this.
Okay, I'll just be real fast then. Every 4 years there is this sort of series of hot takes in the media before the conventions that, like, what is even the point of these things? Why do we cover them? Why do the parties spend so much money on them? Aren't they just dog and pony shows? I do think this time we got actually through the conventions a really, really good sense of how both candidates would approach the presidency, that not necessarily with the literal words they were saying, but in terms of the people they chose to have speak, the order that they chose to have them speak, the decision, on the one hand of how to handle Senator Sanders, how to handle Senator Cruz, on the other hand, and I do think if you look at how the president-elect has handled the last month, pretty much gathering around him members of his family, longtime loyalists, governing, seeming to approach the task of governing not as a conventional Republican, but as a kind of self-enclosed entity who commandeered the party with a distinct view of how government ought to happen. That's what we saw at the convention. We thought it was really weird at the time, and historically speaking, it was really weird. And when you look at the kinds of people who are closest to the president-elect as he goes into government, we've really never seen anything quite like this, regardless of who happens to be, the more sort of standard selections for the 7 p.m. slot on Wednesday night at the convention, or the Secretary of Education and Health and Human Services.
Okay, we're going to conclude, we're going to take a break. We're not going to conclude anything, but we're going to take a break for 15 minutes. If everyone would please be back in their seat actually in 14 minutes at 10 till 11. Thank you.
Yes, although there's some level of.
I think, should I don't know. I have no idea how long they'll last. I mean, you know what? Let's just swap the batteries over.
Oh, no, I'm just changing that. Good job so far.
said that it went fairly well. When we moved to DC back in the mid-80s, we had to have them, so they would have like the big movie van, so we were like freaking out. Smart, good people, it's great. And he said, no, just subscribe to your local newspaper. That's all we want you to do. Oh yeah, no, it's Kansas City nice. Yeah. You are also safely in the 4th district, which is, well, it is the Bruce Stockton district in Kansas City. It's wealthy and smart and yucky, but incredibly active. They're very smart people and they all want to play a role. You know, I give speeches a lot in Pacific places, and I went to a 4th district in one time, and I go, you know, it's easier to go, well, I'm the reporter, and I go, well, I spoke to maybe 5 minutes, people, no, that's not right, okay, I get it. So it's really, you know, an impressive, interesting, smart lawyers, you know, people are really paying attention to this, you know. You're it takes so much energy to work. Let's go. Great. Idea how much energy it just takes to get from place to place. You don't have any idea. You go to Best Buy, it's a full, you know, hour, 45 minutes. Sure. He's a great guy. Executive director. Missouri. I live in Kansas. Yes.
I'm going to ask everyone to please start finding your seats. How you doing? Good to see you, Kelly. Oh, Mr. Helling. How are you? Good to see you. Okay. I'm asking everyone to please take their seats and the panelists to come on out to the main hall. Oh, Stefan, how are you? Good, how are you? Good, good to see you. Eric Pauls, take your seat.
Calling all panelists, can you please take your seats?
If somebody would shoo my panelists out, Colleen is the only one cooperating right now. Yes, yes you do.
Can everybody please take their seats?
I love all the pictures and everything.
Did you get a chance to look at the 76 thing in the room where we have you guys kind of located with the food and all? That's on the 76 campaign and Dole's role and how he was selected and all that. It's really quite good.
The internet's may have the answer.
I know, right? Yes. That could be my Can everybody please take their seats?
One way to do it.
Now we're in trouble.
Mr. McLaughlin, you missed the bell. Wow.
This is the addiction.
That's what happens when you have a person of authority ring a bell, by golly. Thank you very much, Representatives. Is my sound okay? No, I didn't think it was. Distorted. Some people say I'm always distorted. Okay. Still doesn't, okay, now it's starting to sound right. Thank you all for actually getting through. I am astounded. As I said, we've been doing this 15 years, and we actually came within 4 minutes of my goal on this, so thank you all for cooperating. Thank the panelists. Let's start with a question about the Trump candidacy and one of the problems that you guys had to deal with, and I'd like to get your thoughts on it and then get the Clinton's team reaction and then reaction from others. It seemed throughout the campaign that that Mr. Trump was putting himself in a defensive posture, whether it be comments on like Muslim bans, some of the more extreme statements on Hispanic Americans, the feuds on Twitter that a few people referenced previously. Is my sound okay? No. Guys, this is all of a sudden, nobody can hear me. I can't even hear myself anymore.
Yeah, it's nothing changed.
No, yeah. Hello?
Let's try this one.
Yeah, here.
Thank you.
Just grab another wireless mic.
Can I put this on the stand here, Alex?
Yeah.
All right, that's a fair deal.
I'd share with you.
Lawrence, you know better than to trust me with technology. Let me try this again now that I can actually hear myself, and I think you can hear me. The Trump campaign had several points during the campaign where statements or actions by Mr. Trump seemed to create real problems for you guys, and I'd like to get your reaction to some of these and the Clinton team's reaction to it, and then reaction from the rest of the panel. But whether it was statements on Hispanic Americans, whether it was statements about potential temporary Muslim bans, whether it was Twitter feuds with the Khans or with, other individuals. It seemed to go on constantly until the last 2 to 3 weeks of the campaign. And it seemed like, gentlemen, that every time you got any traction, that your candidate would get into one of these and you would take several steps back. How did you guys feel about that from the inside of the campaign? And then I'll ask the Clinton team for their reaction to it.
I understand why you're asking the question. Does this one work?
No.
No. Want to try this one?
Test.
I think it's all the ones up here.
Test.
Does that work, Marlon?
Can you guys hear me?
Well, Sasha's got a wireless.
Let me try this.
Where are you getting all these mics?
Okay. So I understand why you're asking the question. I do take issue with the premise that it necessarily was hurtful. I understand that that might be a reaction that people had. I had it myself on many occasions. Excuse me, in particular, like when he made his comments about Senator McCain. I had quit my job and stopped working my job the Friday, and he said that on Saturday, and I was supposed to start the campaign on Monday, so I assumed that I didn't have a job anymore, but I was wrong, because it seemed to have virtually no effect. There were several occasions where that happened, where he, engaged or sent tweets that seemed terrible, but then they seemed to have no effect on him. So I think that that's one factor that was very significant, which I never understood then, and I still don't now, is that the base, particularly in the primaries, probably less so in the general, but the base of Trump voters didn't really seem to care about, things he said or did that might have seemed outrageous. As a matter of fact, in some cases, I think the reaction from the media to what he thinks he said actually emboldened and sort of empowered his base of people, because they held the media in even lower esteem than they did, Congress and politicians, and, the way the system, they felt was rigged against them. So I think it actually, particularly the primary phase, it had the opposite effect of what you would expect it to happen if a conventional politician had said some of these things. That's one point. The second is that there's been some statements here about, Trump hitting down, or, that phrase has been used repeatedly. I think the fact is what Mr. Trump did was hit back. And he says that himself. You attack me, I'll attack, I'm going to respond to that 10x. You should know that, before you attack me. And I think that in almost every case, his reaction that seemed as if he was, why is he attacking somebody, that's not on his level, was that he was reacting to something, an attack that had made on him. So I think that's how he's always operated in the public domain for decades. I think that's how he conducted himself during the campaign. And I think it had a similar effect. It seemed as if, on the face of it, you would think that it would be a negative thing, but amongst his supporters, which, he was able to assemble a coalition big enough to win, they didn't care.
Let me do a follow-up on that question, because maybe my question, I didn't ask it as precisely as I would like. Didn't the simple fact that you were getting away from focusing on bigger issues and making the issue about Secretary Clinton and about change, didn't that at least kind of give up control of the agenda?
I guess so, but just, his persona, he's personified change, right? Just because he didn't react like a politician would, or like a normal political operative would, advise him to do, which he wouldn't have listened to anyway. I don't think it really, I just don't think I don't think his reaction to these events or people was perceived by people the same way it would be from a politician. It wasn't poll tested, it wasn't spun, it wasn't, there was nothing but, people believed that he was authentic, and that every time he would react in a way that would seem impolitic only reinforced his authenticity, I think, to the people that supported him.
During the Clinton campaign, did you guys see these as gifts when he would do this? I mean, ways that he kind of got himself off what appeared to be his principal message and agenda?
Yes and no. Can you all hear me? Mixed.
Well, can we fix it? Okay. Everybody bear with me, I apologize. It's been perfect
I actually take a similar view to Michael on this. I think they were gifts in some ways. They certainly galvanized a lot of our supporters in some of the ways that they did with his. But they also often distracted from something that we were trying to push. And, you know, typically they did not fit with the exact message that we were pushing either on ourselves or on Mr. Trump. For example, him going after Mr. Khan, and I agree, Donald Trump is a counterpuncher. He didn't hit everyone. Our convention had a lot of people who hit him. He chose to go after the one that I would argue would have got the most news in him continuing that fight. And what that took away from was all of the message that we had tried to deliver during the convention. And so everything the stories that we tried to tell about Hillary Clinton didn't have a shelf life. They were done as soon as the convention was over because all of the news was about Trump hitting a Gold Star father and a Gold Star mother. I think that's something that we saw frequently. Judge Curiel and that fight happened, I believe, right around the time of Secretary Clinton's national security speech. I would argue his recent Hamilton tweet, I think was a fairly clever way of taking some attention away from some other conflict of interest stories in a way that cost him nothing. His supporters aren't concerned if he hits a Broadway musical. That's not, that is in fact showing that he's sort of against the establishment. And I think that that's something, I will give Mr. Trump very little credit during the course of this panel, but he is a master of understanding what makes news and what makes news directors want to put him in the lead of the story. And while many of those stories, you look at it and you say he's going after a Gold Star father, or he said this, or he said that, ultimately we weren't able to drive a message during that time. And I think that, you know, he was in fact at least showing some people he's willing to sort of he's not your average politician. That was, I think, a fundamental part of his message, and that was delivered over the course of some of these. So I agree with Michael. I don't accept the premise that these were necessarily bad for him.
Okay. Other reactions to some of these very controversial positions and tweets and et cetera that Mr. Trump took during the campaign? Mary?
I was listening to some remarks by one of Donald Trump's pollsters, Tony Fabrizio, that John had mentioned earlier, and he's shed some really interesting light on what was happening in the polling and what we were seeing as people were reacting to these types of things. And so many times when Donald Trump said something controversial, Republicans would sort of no longer be supporting him in the polls. They would say, no, I'm not supporting him, but they would go to the undecided column or the third party candidates, and but then they would eventually come back. And so we would see that, you know, Donald Trump would make these controversial remarks and that his support would drop, but it wasn't going to Hillary Clinton, it was going to the undecided or to the I don't know, or I'm not sure if I'm going to vote. And the real question all along was, are those voters going to vote? Are they ultimately going to come to vote for Donald Trump? It just didn't seem like they were going to vote for Hillary Clinton, and ultimately they ended up coming back to Donald Trump.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on this subject?
Yeah, does this microphone work?
Nope.
Oh, boy.
Do we have any other cordless mics? Okay. Thank you. Again, I apologize. We don't
There we
understand
go.
what's going on. So go ahead, Alan.
Two quick things. I think when Donald Trump replies, he's defending himself. I think the public likes it when he defends himself in a direct way and not the way a politician does by damning with faint praise or being passive aggressive. The second thing, just because those elites, and I don't use that pejoratively, but the Morning Joe panelists, because they say it so does not make it so. I would challenge our panelists on the convention being dystopian and dark because somebody says it. What's dark about Scott Baio, by the way? And it just being direct and matter of fact does not make it dark or dystopian. And so I think they like that. And again, whether it's the Muslim ban or something else, where the editorial board of even the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, they may think it's awful, go out in the public, and they don't. And I think this campaign demonstrated a real dichotomy between the elites, again, not in a pejorative way, and regular voters.
Bill, if I can just jump in.
Yeah,
I do want
please
to
do
push
that.
back on that just a little bit, because this notion that it was like a bunch of, it was like Harold Ford Jr. on Morning Joe, and nobody else was offended by this stuff. Like, the public polling and the private polling, your own private polling, demonstrates like pretty conclusively that most people were offended by many of the things he said about private people, about Latinos, about Muslims. The fact that it didn't decide the election does not mean that it wasn't a factor in how he was perceived by the public and how he is perceived now as the incoming president, right? That, I mean, all credit to him that he won the election. He enters as the most unpopular, distrusted incoming president we've had in the history of modern polling.
I guess to respond quickly, on some, yes, but the way blanketly anything that was mildly controversial, the Morning Joe panelists, oh, this is awful, and I think some of the polling does not, the public did support some of the things that Donald Trump said, so it is not certainly universal on either side.
Okay. Well, let's move around along to the next subject. And this is really for the Clinton team. You guys had a tough weekend in September. You had the basket full of deplorable comments, I think, on a Friday, and then you had the health issue that appeared, or the perceived health issue that appeared on Sunday. What was your reaction to that kind of double blow, and do you think that did any damage, or did it slow any momentum you had developed?
It was we spent, Brian Fallon, who was our press secretary, Brian Fallon and I spent an entire week on Pneumonia Gate. And it was in a campaign a cycle that had a lot of absurdities and false equivalencies of Hillary Clinton. I think that the press and Washington Post, God love them, had a great analysis in yesterday's paper the day before about about false equivalency, and by that I mean that the press feeling pressure, if you write 5 bad stories about Donald Trump, you have to write 5 bad stories about Hillary Clinton. And I remember there was, in particular on this like a story that stands out in my mind as an example of that was, it wasn't Alex, but it was in the New York Times, and there was a story about Donald Trump making racist comments, and at the time, this is pretty early on, at the time Hillary had attended Nancy Reagan's funeral and said in an interview at her funeral with Andrea Mitchell, talked about how Nancy Reagan had been a great advocate for AIDS prevention, which of course is not true. And she had conflated, I know what she was thinking of. It wasn't Nancy Reagan. She conflated some things in her mind. And the New York Times wrote a story that, Nancy Reagan said, or Hillary Clinton said some nice things about Nancy Reagan at her funeral. Donald Trump made a racist comment. They're equally bad. And this is when I went into the general election, when it was clear in May that Donald Trump was the nominee. This was our greatest fear, was that because we were running against such an unconventional candidate that always said very controversial things, the press would be compelled to treat them equally and as equally bad, and that was going to plague us, and it plagued us every single day until Election Day, and it's among the factors for why she didn't ultimately win, although it is time to note, now that we're how many hours in, that she did win the popular vote by a significant and historic margin. So that is the backdrop for Pneumonia Gate. And the idea, here's what happened. The woman, I feel like this isn't working again. Is this working? Okay. She was sick. She went to the doctor. The doctor said, yeah, you have a case of pneumonia. If you're a normal person, I'd tell you to stop for 5 days and relax, but I understand you can't do that. And so she did what a lot of people do, what a lot of women in particular do, which is soldier on. And then and then she had her spell at the 9/11 event, which I think, if he was probably a contributing factor there. But at any rate, this was held up as if as a heinous crime that Hillary Clinton had tried to perpetuate on the American people, and that she didn't tell everyone that she had pneumonia and what was she trying to hide. And we spent an entire week on it. And it was absurd, and we had dueling health letters, and Trump went on Dr. Oz, and when are you going on Dr. Oz? Why won't Hillary Clinton go on Dr. Oz? And we are 2 months out from a general election where we are facing 2 candidates that have really different views of of America and how and where we should take our country from here. But that is what people spent their time on. Deplorables really, here's something Hillary Clinton doesn't normally do: screw up. She really, if you think about it, and not true for some other people I've worked for, even some people in her own family. She rarely misspeaks. She rarely says something that she needs to correct, like on the campaign trail. And this is something that, as soon as she said, we're like, that, it's not, you should never characterize your opponent's supporters. That's just a bad idea. And she also misspoke, and at any rate, we knew it was a problem, and within 12 hours, you put a statement apologizing for that. So, and it's fair to note, it was a bad thing to say. She apologized for it, and it was fair for the press to make that an issue. But Pneumonia-gate was an absurd and a destructive example of false equivalency that we had to battle through, and it cost us a lot. September is the last time I believe we were going to lose. I thought in September I could very much see the path by which this all spiraled out of control. We continued to battle things like Pneumonia-gate. And, I saw the window in which every day you'd see a window into parts of the country where you can understand that it's very possible for Trump to win. After we got through the debates, I stopped believing that. I thought we were going to win, but that was the hardest period of the general election for us.
Okay. Trump campaign, how did you react to that weekend and the two things that transpired? I mean, did you think you'd been given an opportunity there?
I think the one thing that you're talking about with Donald Trump, with his Oz show and everything, it's his gut instinct that he knows. He has a gut instinct for the PR stories, et cetera. And like, I knew some of my other Republican clients were at the 9/11 memorial, and when Secretary Clinton had to leave, they were saying, wasn't that warm? It wasn't. Who knows? But it was like, it just. And I sympathize for you. You had to deal with it with the press. It's like, if she had pneumonia, all these press people here would want to know. She's not feeling well today or something like that. Just say so. But it just led to more speculation. But it wasn't. It did present an opportunity for us, and he was able to drive that. And this stuff. He does have a gut instinct. There was absolutely no focus groups polling on that issue or anything like that to go with. It's just a gut instinct of what the media is going to report about. And if it's to our advantage, he would go for it.
Okay. Sasha has a comment here.
It's worth noting, right, this is after some part of a year of Trump, free of context, talking about her not having stamina, she's going to go home and sleep, doesn't work as hard as I do, and that was not in response to anything. And I'm sort of wondering, for the Clinton campaign's perspective, did your response to pneumonia change because he had been sort of inserting this she's old and sick thing into the campaign? Did you feel like you could not just come out in the way you normally would and say she's taking a day off from the trail because a doctor told her she should?
Sure. And I felt that it was projection that he said that she didn't work hard, didn't have stamina. Say what you will about Hillary Clinton, like, the woman's got stamina. And but it was, it was very much part of the coverage, and it does seem, particularly for a woman, that you have to, you were put in a position where you had to prove that.
Okay. Other comments from outside the campaigns about that weekend, or kind of what you saw transpire? Anybody want to say something else?
Here you go.
Sorry, thank you.
But before you go there, the one thing we did go after the campaign, the deplorables comment, they did make an ad. We did push that out there because it definitely reinforced the base. That was the other opportunity. It played to the feeling among our voters, and it definitely strengthened them. We saw that did help us. And like you said, it was a rare mistake on her part, but the campaign and Donald Trump took advantage of that. So.
I do agree with that. Being at Trump rallies and talking to voters after the deplorable comments, certainly it was that rare moment where they did have kind of a galvanizing kind of comment from the other side. I think just one thing, when we were looking at the polling in real time, anytime that Hillary Clinton was in the news, she might have been behind. Anytime Trump was in the news, he was behind. So I think the polls really reflected, it was this weird kind of thing where maybe you didn't really want to be the center of attention that week, because that was when you were kind of behind, at least in the public polling.
Any other thoughts on this? Okay, I want to move to the debates. And because we do have limited time and limited microphones, I just want to throw out a proposition here. I mean, I think conventional wisdom, and I felt I was pretty objectively observing debates, was that Secretary Clinton won all three. I'm curious as to the Trump team's reaction to that and what you may have seen in your polling that indicated that Mr. Trump did better, and then the reaction from the Clinton team, and then finally from the other panelists.
I'll leave it to John to speak to the polling, what that showed, but I think, again, I sort of keep going back to the same theme, is that Mr. Trump is not a politician. This is the first debate was the first time he'd been on stage one-on-one, with his opponent or a politician. So I think that there's, I thought he performed extremely well considering the circumstances and the stakes that were at hand there. So, and I think, that, again, as was mentioned yesterday, I think the expectations for him to perform in the primary debates was low. I think the expectation in the media and in the, the elite that Alan spoke about, and the same was true, I think, for the general election. And I think considering, the stakes, the circumstances, this was the first time he'd done this. I thought he did exceedingly well. The second debate, I was amused by the lead up to that, because everyone talked about how the town hall format was not his forte, that he was not going to be successful in that, and he didn't know how to conduct himself. But in fact, during the primaries and the caucuses, he had performed in 100 town hall meetings, and in my opinion, he'd done extremely well in that format. I thought that extemporaneous, response and ability to walk around the stage was an advantage to him. So I thought the lead up to the second debate, that the format was going to be a problem for him, I thought was mistaken. And then the third debate, again, I'm just talking about my personal views, not what the polling has showed, is that I thought it was a fairly well-matched debate, and I thought they both did well. So, this, again, the theme that he lost all three debates, I believe, is incorrect. I think that's, it's another sort of a narrative about, his performance that I don't believe that has become, truth in the media, and I don't believe it was true with the voting base. And I think that, the people the deplorables that voted for him, I don't think they saw it the same way the New York Times did. No offense to New York Times.
I was going to say, the first debate, maybe during the first 20 minutes, and these were like record numbers of people watching these debates because of the election. And it wasn't a normal election in that, this was a really, understatement, hard-fought election that both candidates were going at it and all these things. Everybody was trying to play offense every day and get off defense. But in that first debate, he did really well in the beginning, but then he, later on, Secretary Clinton shifted the agenda on him, and so the post-debate coverage was probably not as favorable. So that debate didn't go that well. But the other debates, he fought back, and in the fighting back, he brought back his voters. As Mike was saying, we could see that they were coming back in. And they couldn't get away from us. We couldn't get away from them. And ultimately, when Donald Trump wanted to restore his numbers, he'd just go back on offense versus Hillary Clinton. That second debate in the town hall format, I thought he did very well playing offense, but it was hard fighting, contentious. It was just a really tough debate. And the media coverage, the digital stuff that came off it was helped restore our base to keep us in a close race. And for somebody who is not perceived, I've seen Hillary Clinton debate, for years when she was a senator in New York, and she's formidable, and she did it again in all the primary debates, and she was formidable in this stuff. She knows her stuff. But Donald Trump went back to playing offense in the second debate, and I think it helped him, and it showed in our polls anyway. We were doing battleground polls. We weren't doing national then.
Okay.
The winner of the second debate was Ken Bone.
Okay. Clinton campaign?
Well, we would concur with your analysis. I think
My analysis or the Trump campaign?
yours.
Okay.
I think that our fears going into the debate were that, one, expectations were very high for her because she is a good debater, because she is more experienced, and two, that expectations would be so low for him that our biggest concern in the first debate was that the bar would be, can he keep his temper? And if so, he has won the debate, that he has beaten expectations. And our fear in the second debate was we thought he would do well in a town hall. We thought that it was a good format for him, that to be able to bounce off a voter as opposed to the media, where he uses the media as a foil, would stop him from sort of going off the rails and would keep him in a place where he was able to deliver message. And I think that was probably more true in that second debate than the other two. We spent a lot of time before the debates reminding people that debates are also about substance. They're not just style, that you shouldn't just grade him on a curve, that they need to, the bar should be, are you showing that you can be president? And that the temperament is a part of that, but really there's a larger bar there. But I will say that for the first 20 minutes of the first debate, I was very worried. I think we all were. He was delivering a message. His tone was different than in the rallies. And what Hillary Clinton does well, or certainly did well in those three debates, was she baited him. And I think that you saw that probably half an hour to 45 minutes in, and she sort of threw out some questions. Some of it was about whether or not he inherited his wealth, which he did not like, and responded with, I only got $1 million, which we thought was not a great answer for many voters. And she seized on that, and she came prepared. She'd done her homework, but also she had a sense from watching him of what might get under his skin, and I think it did. I think that his tone was different in the first half of both the first and the third debates than they were in the latter half. And so we thought that she did a good job. Again, we also thought the debates were a great opportunity because of that record viewership to really break through with policy. And she had a lot of it, and she was proud of it. And she thought they were answers that people needed to hear. And so we thought debates were a great opportunity.
Okay.
Can I add something there? So I think I said yesterday they're the only times you had Hillary Clinton unfiltered, so that was a huge benefit to us. So the debates were very useful that way. Second is it didn't get as much attention in the news, but we felt like her economic message was powerful in these debates, and exit polls are the only measurement we have to go by at this point, but exit polls showed that if you were voting if you said the economy was the most important issue to you, more of those people voted for Hillary Clinton. And she won with voters making less than $50,000 a year. So we felt like that, even though it was not part of the, it wasn't a big part of the news coverage, that those were important outlets, the debates were important outlets for her economic message as well. The second debate, we thought Donald Trump would do better because Christina said, he's playing off of voters, and it's hard to go into a downward spiral if voters are changing topics on you and you're having to answer their questions directly. But, he also had his stunt at the beginning of the second debate where he did the press conference off-site. And, as I had to talk to Hillary, it was really fun about that ahead of the debate. I said, you understand he's doing this for one reason only, and that is to rattle you and get under your skin. She's like, I got that. Thank you, I got that. And it didn't rattle her, and it didn't get under her skin. And so even though I think the second debate was a better debate for Trump than the first debate, we came out of it just as a campaign and having felt like they tried to intimidate us and they tried to scare us, and it didn't work, and that was liberating. And the final thing I'll say about the debates is that among the things that I think we could have done that would have made a difference in the ultimate outcome is if we had asked for a fourth debate to happen, because we had 2.5 weeks from the third debate to the election. And when the debates were just very powerful because it was the clarity of the choice, the two of them were on stage, there's a lot of, they were high drama, they're high octane, and then off the debate stage, nothing could match that in the earned media space. And when we're in this situation where we don't really have a event like that to grab onto to break through, Trump is going to dominate the coverage, and we're sort of adrift, and that's what happened after the third debate.
Okay.
Well, and, I mean, yeah, I assume we'll talk more about Jim Comey later, but yeah.
Any other reaction from journalists, Mary, about the debates? Did you guys feel? Let me ask you this, and get a couple of you to answer. Did you guys feel like I felt that Secretary Clinton won all three, or did you see this kind of alternative view that maybe Mr. Trump was working under a different set of standards and guidelines?
I think that Secretary Clinton did very well in all three debates, but I think the one thing that we haven't talked about that I'm sure we will talk about is that the second debate was completely overshadowed by the Billy Bush video that had come out. And so, I mean, while the debate happened, it was just unbelievably distracting to have the coverage be, okay, there was a debate. I mean, even the debate itself was sort of strange in that it was so much about the videotape and so little about the issues. And so while I think Secretary Clinton did well, it wasn't, that particular debate was not about the issues as much. And so that was difficult because she performed better on the issues.
Okay. Any other thoughts about that subject?
I would quickly add that, leading up to the debates and also 9/11, when the pneumonia thing came out, there was sort of a period of time I think for the Clinton campaign when Secretary Clinton was busy doing a lot of fundraising, I think especially the month of August. There were chunks at a time when she would not be doing public rallies, so reporters weren't really sort of having access to her aides. And I think it is sort of important to note that, of course, we can write about ads, we can write about her through the prism of what her opponent is saying, but when I think the principle is not out there and really sort of engaging with the public, and there's a venue for reporters to cover, Hillary Clinton said X today. It did make it hard for, I think, Secretary Clinton and her team to sort of get her message out there in some ways, and during that time, throughout that time, Trump was sort of dominating the headlines, not always with positive news and not always, being able to avoid controversy. But I do think that was sort of the background context leading up to the later summer months that were sort of important in terms of the kind of, national media coverage that the two candidates were getting.
I mean, I think she certainly got the better of the debates. But I do remember thinking after the first one and then the subsequent two, wondering whether there was a sort of missed opportunity for her in those. I mean, it seemed like there was a conscious decision for her not to engage him directly. There was the sort of laying of all this bait and traps, but she never addressed him directly. She seemed to avoid. Yeah, I think in the first debate not once, and in the
first debate.
But
Trump team, do you feel like she did engage him directly? I feel like she really did engage him directly.
I felt like there was very little eye contact. There was very little. I mean, she was talking about him, and clearly got a reaction out of him. But it was often in the third person or directed at the moderator or the town hall. The normal people. I don't know what they are. Never met one. And once it became clear that, especially in the second halves of those debates, the first and the third, that his attention sort of flagged, that he could be pulled into, distracted, pulled into conflicts, I did wonder whether there was a sort of missed opportunity for her to sort of be more of a catalyst in trying to unwind him and get him to lose his temper, if that was the standard. And some of the... Anyway,
I mean, I think I think we would just sort of disagree with I don't think I'm alone in this, disagree with the premise, because I think whether or not she was addressing him directly, and some of that has faded into my memory, she specifically baited him on a number of occasions. and frankly, the first debate was was when she went after him on women and on Alicia Machado. She certainly took the fight to him. Again, whether or not she was addressing him directly, and as the Oppo person, had no complaints with how she did at laying an argument out for people to really see, and thought she delivered some pretty tough punches. So I don't think we viewed them as missed opportunities.
The other thing we would balance was that we also knew this was the only opportunity we would have for people to see her talking about issues they cared about, because that was never, ever going to get covered in the earned media. That was just not going to happen. And paid, I think, mattered very little in this election. So we also...
At what point did you come to that conclusion?
About which part?
Paid media, not...
That's a view I had all along. Will my colleagues not hear me say that now that I mumbled it? It just never felt to me, even in the primary, that paid really mattered.
Okay. That's an important subject. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Let's move along to the Trump campaign and your reaction. The October 7th Access video emerged. Did you feel that would fundamentally alter the campaign, or did you feel that was just a bump in the road? You need a microphone.
Details. We definitely took a hit in the polls that weekend, and like I was reaching out, but in a way, I was expecting maybe more stuff to come after it, because you never know what's out there. But it's like that hit came, and I think Donald Trump himself got more disciplined after that, and he definitely got more focused, got back on message. It's one of those campaigns. It's so unusual. Normally when you're doing campaigns, the people are saying, "Oh, your candidate's reading off the teleprompter." Donald Trump would read off the teleprompter. People would cheer, go, "Hey, he stuck to message. That was great." And so he got more resolved and more disciplined, and there was enough time to recover. And it was unfortunate. He apologized, and it was just, and having gone through similar kind of stuff when I was working for Governor Schwarzenegger, when there was going to be kind of stories, I'm like, the sad part is people. You can't argue this stuff because people believe it, but there was the videotape that was really real, and you just got to move on. You got to apologize and move on. And when he did that and got back on offense, he was fine, but there was enough time to recover, so we were fortunate in that regard. So, and I think at that point, I got to give, Kellyanne Conway a lot of credit, and Steve Bannon and the people advising him and his family members. They really, got around him and got stronger. Mike he would have seen it firsthand on the road. But they got more disciplined and more resolved and more focused on the message with a month to recover. So that was important.
So let me ask a follow-up to that. And so in kind of an odd way, was that a positive turning point for the campaign in the sense that it made him a lot more disciplined? And
well, you're in this character fight. So like, Jen was talking about, you're in this character fight, and, at times he would have an instinct to go back, like when he would talk about it, being out there on the trail and being healthy, et cetera. A lot of this stuff is fair game at that point, and the voters are all absorbing this stuff. So, in the test of character, to apologize, to move on. And the ironic part is, before Alex was talking about, he's coming in with big negatives. Either candidate would have come in with big negatives right now. It was a really unique and historic election in that regard. That the lesser of two evils was an understatement this time as far as the average voter was going. But his numbers are, we haven't released it, but I got a poll where I'm going to put it out Monday, where his job approval is 48-41. His favorable, unfavorables are moving even, so he's trending up. So, so things are changing from where they were, but the idea of, and you hear them saying the expectations were so low, well, people are being pleasantly surprised now that he's more disciplined, he's more on message, and he's more focused about solving their problems. So that's good.
I might also say this, and John referred that, from the perspective of being on the campaign trail with him, we had reached a point of momentum, in particular with the Trump rallies. They were getting bigger and bigger, and there was sort of a momentum that they took on during that period and all the way through the end, frankly, that that never was really impacted either. And those, the energy and the media created by the Trump rallies from the very beginning to the very end were a significant factor, I think, across the whole race. And we saw no diminution of that. It had zero impact on that part of the I understand there are many parts of the campaign, but on that part, there was really no major impact. There was a continued momentum of excitement and, anticipation and energy that the rallies, created, which were, again, not the entire factor for the race, but they were an important one consistently from start to finish, and those weren't really impacted at all by that incident.
I wonder if the Clinton campaign, how you guys reacted to that. I'm sure you saw an intensification of your support, but did you see anything else coming out of that incident, A, and B, did you note internally that at some point Trump became more disciplined as a candidate?
Absolutely, to the last part. But just to paint a picture of what happened that day, because I think people forget it, that was an incredibly busy day. In the morning, Donald Trump had said that he felt like the Central Park Five should not have been freed. Then we had the DHS take an incredibly, I believe, unprecedented action of saying that the Russians were trying to influence the election. That was a major thing, and actually a number of us were on a conference call at the time when all of a sudden this thing popped up in our email, and the digital director and I said, hey guys, this is no longer news. So we can keep talking about it, but we just saw this video, and suddenly you could see it on the TV screens outside around the campaign. I think it was a big moment. We certainly saw things from it. I do think it's worth noting, this is, Donald Trump is not your average candidate. You had the fight with Megyn Kelly. You had, and we tried to push reporters to, this is not an errant comment. It is extreme, but it is, it is shocking but not surprising, given some of the other things, and we tried to point reporters to it. But the truth is, I think for some voters, that was the case, where you knew these things, and to Alex's point earlier, you knew these things about them. We thought they were disqualifying. Some voters did not. This may have solidified for certain voters their opinions of Trump. This may have diminished them, but it may not have made the difference in voting. I do think it dominated the news. Again, we couldn't break through. Now, he was having a particularly bad news cycle. I think he came out and apologized. He also then threatened to sue women who came out and argued that he had, in fact, done what he sort of said he was going to do in the video. And so I don't think it's quite as simple as people got to see him apologize. I think it lasted for him. Other things shook up the race in different ways, and certainly on our side. But for us, it was a big moment. It was a big moment that overtook some other things that might have been big moments that might have impacted things like WikiLeaks and some things like that. But I also am not sure that it didn't just solidify with some voters what they already thought, so that the people that it had the biggest impact with may have been people who were already not voting for him.
Okay. I'd like some reaction from some of the other panelists on this. Colleen, Caitlin, did you guys have any thoughts when this video came out?
Well, it was an interesting day. The moment that the video came out, I happened to be doing a radio show roundtable, and so we're kind of like seeing this come out in real time. It's on the TV screen, and we're on live radio, and people are talking about this and asking us about this, and we're just seeing this for the first time. And it was interesting because every person on the roundtable initially said, and again, this is just in the immediate moments after this, just seeing it for the first time, but every person on the roundtable said, that's really bad, but nothing that Donald Trump has said that seemed really bad has mattered up until this point. Why would this be different? And so just kind of in that immediate moment, we all said this is the campaign where it is impossible for Donald Trump to say something that offends his supporters so much so that they back away from him. And so we said, why would this be any different? And but obviously within several hours, it became apparent that this, in fact, was the one time that it was going to be different. And so you saw over the course of the weekend, you saw all these Republican defections. You saw Republican officials coming out and saying, we have daughters, we can't abide by this, we can't support this person. But the amazing thing was that this this too subsided. And in the end, Donald Trump had just enough time to kind of recover from this, regroup, and move on from it. And I think Christina is right that people who were already offended by Donald Trump and thought that what he said about women in the past was unacceptable, this reinforced that for them. But a lot of people were willing to set this aside, as they were willing to set other things that Trump had said in the past aside, and say his message of change is what really matters to me, and I'm willing to overlook a lot of other things.
Okay, Caitlin?
Yeah, I mean, one of the really interesting moments of that whole weekend, because on Saturday you saw those defections just dripping in, but being outside Trump Tower, and it was pouring rain that day, and you had this kind of, people had started to come and voice their support for him, and kind of had this whole little like mini rally outside, and Trump ended up coming out later that evening and, shooting his hand up in the air. And that was a really, a moment of, defiance for him, and I think that just watching his supporters respond to that was really interesting. But I remember, talking throughout the next couple of weeks to particularly women on the campaign trail. I remember talking to a mother in Ohio, and she was saying, I'm just lumping that into, the, 40% of things that I don't like about him, right? I mean, it was just, I was struck by that it was, it seemed so egregious to a lot of people, but to those people were willing to look past it. And then we saw over the next week, all those Republicans who defected, a lot of them came back. And so I think that was the signal too, to your point about timing, that was important.
Any other thoughts on this? Marlon?
Yeah, one quick thing on defections. I actually think that embolden their supporters, right? So you have all these establishment Republicans start to say, oh, my daughters, I can't do this. I have a wife and kids, that's a whole other story. And that really, I think, the episode you just said outside of Trump Tower, I actually think that all emboldened their supporters. Like, look at all these politicians who've been around 20, 30 years who are all just like running away and not embracing this, what folks have said, authentic person. And I think it actually energized like his core base, and actually was kind of a catalyst to use that to keep amping up their supporters.
Okay. Any other comments? Alex?
Yeah, I would just say I think in the week and to 2 weeks right after that, you did see this kind of dilemma for Democrats, less the Clinton campaign and more for the rest of the party, that you saw sort of throughout the election, where on the one hand there was this desire to split Trump off from the rest of the party and leave him sort of twisting in the wind, unsupported by mainstream Republican figures. On the other hand, there was this desire for Democrats who were running for everything else but president to tie their opponents for Senate, for House, for governor to the top of the ticket. And so at the same time as on the one hand you had Democrats, including the Clinton campaign, I think, wanting to give moderate voters and soft Republicans a kind of permission slip to jump ship. You heard from every other corner of the party, including the current president, this effort to kind of shame Republicans for not jumping ship sooner. And I do wonder if in the end those two forces kind of worked in tension with each other, where if you're a voter who wants permission to not vote for the Republican nominee, but you also kind of hear the Democratic president like making fun of Republicans who are exactly like you and who were supporting him up to this point, I do wonder if that ended up being counterproductive, or at least sort of mutually canceling each other out.
Okay. Sasha?
It'll still take a few months for us to I think, get to the bottom of the source of polling error. We need to sort of have states update their voter files to see who voted and who didn't, to know what the causes of some of the polling error. But if, as some people suspect, a part of it was an unwillingness of voters to tell callers running surveys that they were supporting Trump, either that they were describing themselves as undecided or that they were portraying themselves as maybe leaning Clinton when they were undecided. I do wonder if that event would be something that would make it a lot more difficult, especially for Republican women, right-leaning independent women, after the leaders of their party have basically said this is the thing that pushes him beyond the pale to publicly, or not publicly, but at least to another human being on a phone call, declare themselves as a supporter of his, and that you create this dynamic where it became really difficult for people to publicly identify as Trump supporters, like certain parts of the electorate, in ways that could have been led to the, on your part, sort of the optimistic view of where things stood off of the polling going into late October.
Okay.
Can I just add one
Yes,
very quick
absolutely,
thing?
MJ.
My recollection of the day after the tape had come out, I also had the privilege of, being on Trump Tower duty that day. This was a day when all of the, defections came in, and, it was almost hard to keep track of how many people were coming out publicly to say, I can no longer support our party's nominee. And to me, it really did feel different. I really felt like, this is not like the other moments or mistakes that Trump had made, his comment about McCain, which didn't seem to matter, his comment about Muslim Americans, which didn't seem to matter in the end. This to me did feel different, but I think having covered Trump and sort of, talked to his voters and his supporters, there was that sort of nagging feeling where I felt like I had to sort of dismiss that and almost dismiss that and just simply report what was being said publicly by his, by members of his party, rather than to draw the conclusion, well, this time, this could really be the time that really does it for him, that this could really be the end. I think that reporters covering him really sort of learned that lesson. I also just wanted to point out, I did this interesting thing where I went back and called back some of the voters I had met throughout the election who were, at the time that I interviewed them, were undecided, and to go back and check in with them to see who they had ultimately voted for. And a couple of the people who ended up supporting Trump, and actually one person who did vote for Clinton, they all sort of noted that they felt like Trump had toned things down towards the end, and that seemed to really resonate with them. So there's this very different sort of baseline for, I think, Trump and Clinton, where for Trump, he was constantly sort of making mistakes, and, there were so many gaffes, and as Jen was saying earlier, Hillary Clinton was not that kind of candidate. She rarely screwed up, and I think at the end, for some of the supporters who may have been sort of on the fence about Trump, the fact that he, at the end, was a little bit more scripted, read more speeches off the teleprompter, that little bit of discipline, I think, could have, ended up sort of going a long way.
So there seems to be a consensus that after the did you want to add something, Mike, to that subject?
I just wanted to say, again, from my perspective, having seen this campaign from the beginning to the end, was that it's this divide on how people perceive him, I think, is important. She says that he made a lot of mistakes and gaffes, and I think his supporters see that as how a normal person is, like me. I make mistakes and gaffes all day long. And so, again, it's sort of a contrast between, politicians that are, they test everything by polls, and they have focus groups, and they make, they write the script 10 times, and they rewrite the speech 100 times. That's what people were against, and that's why Trump won, is because that whole sort of culture of, prepared and politicians for every purpose was rejected by the voters this time around. And I sort of seen that the same way, that it, again, in a bizarre way, I actually agree with what Marlon said about how that episode, like many of the others before that, just sort of reinforced his support among his core base.
Okay, we've talked about a little bit about the discipline that candidate Trump started to adopt going ahead after Access Hollywood, and then we come to the October 28th Comey announcement, and I'd be curious to get a reaction from both campaigns, starting with the Clinton team, and then everyone else on the panel on pardon me?
Marlon very gingerly held me the microphone.
Oh, I see.
Anticipating what was coming
Yes.
next.
Marlon's a KU kid. He knows what's going on, so let me try to get back on my train of thought. That was pretty good, though. I like that. What I was going to ask is, at the time, what was your assessment of that at the time, and in retrospect, how important to that, to the overall outcome of the campaign was that announcement?
We think the overall impact was that it ultimately cost us the election. You know, it wasn't the only factor, but it was the factor that came in at the end that was too much for us to overcome. In the moment, I was on our campaign plane, and we had terrible wireless on our campaign plane. And Kristen Welker from ABC News said there's some story that just posted about the FBI reopening the email investigation. And I was just like, that's, you know, they must be conflating something that can't be, right? And it took us about an hour before we got, were you on the plane, Colleen? Yeah. I remember your face. You're like, yeah, you should read the story. And then we read it, and it was just hard to figure out what he was actually talking about. You know, it was by the end of the day we understood. Hours later, we understood that this was from Huma's emails, but like you just had no concept early on, like what he was talking about for hours, and obviously extraordinarily concerned because. The FBI director is someone, as Alex noted, that has, that office has a lot of credibility with the American public. And I knew that this was beyond extraordinary. In my view, the original sin was Comey holding that press conference in July, which in and of itself is an extraordinary act that, you know, he was behaving more like a prosecutor than an investigator, a prosecutor and a judge. And then and it's so complicated. I'm really, really worried the public was just going to experience this as the email investigation has been reopened. I also knew enough from government and reading the letter that Comey sent that, you know, it's possible he and his team thought this is carefully worded. People will understand that maybe there's not anything here. We just want to cover our bases. But we knew it was extraordinarily damaging. And I, you know, because this is also for the record, I have to note if the press had been more responsible in covering this story all along, I don't think Jim Comey would have felt the need to take these extraordinary measures early, as he did starting in July, and then again in sending this letter. But what we decided to do was, the public are going to hear a lot about this. This is a big story. We can't stop coverage of it. So let's at least give people a way to think about it. And that's why we had Hillary do a press conference later that same day, just to note some of the important things from the letter. Like you know, I can't remember his exact words, but it's like, there's our emails, they may or may not be relevant. We, like, by all means, look at them. We're sure they aren't going to change the conclusion. And then trying to background reporters to remind them that Comey said no reasonable prosecutor would move forward with the case. So because they had already sort of established that, the idea that this emails, whatever they found, would change anything was unlikely. And then there were a lot of people on the outside of our campaign that were able to do press to lay down the predicate of how extraordinary this was. And, you know, in our view, and the view of a lot of our supporters, and a lot of people on Capitol Hill, like very inappropriate interference from the FBI director. And we thought that was important to do because there was going to be a lot of coverage of this to make sure when people did hear about it, and, you know, the way people garnered information and made decisions in the 2016 race is, you know, there were just different threads of information that would form a quilt of your opinion, and we wanted to make sure that when people caught glimpses of this, at least they were seeing there's something not right about what happened here, to have some doubts about it. It raised us a lot of money. We raised, I think, you know better, I think it was a record-setting because our supporters were angry about it, and a lot of our base supporters were angry about it. But at the same time, we saw, and this had started, we knew that there would be a natural tightening in the race after the third debate. I noted that it started tightening, and we saw polls starting to close. It was hard to determine in that moment, was that Comey, was that WikiLeaks, was that normal tightening? But in the end, we ended up being anywhere from 5 to 2 points off our projection in almost in all the battlegrounds from where the vote was, and we think that it just really depressed our turnout.
Okay, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Jennifer, so just let me restate what I think I heard and tell me if this is a fair restatement. At the time, you thought you were going to be able to successfully manage this, but in retrospect, you feel it probably was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's
Yeah, we think it was the
back.
straw. Yeah, and that it, we thought we could manage it. What was very hard, and it was, and this is true of WikiLeaks, was, and this is what I said, what I did about wanting a fourth debate, because every day with WikiLeaks, every day there was a new story, and the stories themselves weren't necessarily that damaging, but there was something new to cover every day. And that meant often people covering us, the lead of their story was about WikiLeaks, not about whatever Hillary Clinton said that day. That's a terrible, terrible way to end your campaign. And then we had this on top of it, and we had 5 solid days of wall-to-wall Comey coverage in the last 11 days. And it was just, it made me physically ill that that's the position that we were in and having to battle, and how damaging that is, and what we think. And then at the end, of course, and on Sunday before the election, Comey sends another letter saying, "Oh, never mind. Well, great. Thanks for bringing the issue back up. We would have preferred that it just went away." And I'm sure that enraged, to some degree, Trump supporters who were like, "See, it's rigged. Look, they think she's going to win, so now the FBI director is like trying to cover himself and coming at the last minute and saying and absolving her." And I think that it just depressed our turnout, and people who were undecided might have gone his way or might have stayed home. But on election night, but what we saw was states, like I said, we were anywhere from 5 to 2 points lower than we expected. And, in some states like Virginia, we had enough of a cushion, but in states like Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, we didn't.
Okay. Go ahead, Marlon.
Yeah. I just also want to tie this to what MJ was just talking about a second ago. You had a candidate, Trump, who was getting more discipline, and post the incident we were just speaking of, and then, we finished the last debate, and then the Comey letter drops. So the last week of media is that, right? Meanwhile, you have him doing rallies, et cetera. On our side, if you took that away, and I'm interested to hear Colleen's perspective because she was on the plane, our crowds and everything were getting bigger, more energetic, more exciting. I remember we went to Philadelphia and North Carolina, and like the energy and what was happening was we hadn't felt that on the campaign the entire time. So we were doing all that as well, but that wasn't what was discussed because you had the backdrop of this letter. So you couldn't close in a way that shows like, here's our closing message, look at the energy, look at the momentum. That was not what was getting covered in the press. Last thing I'll say is it did have an effect in a way of emboldening us on the both the money and the volunteer side. Like we had an incredible weekend of how many doors we knocked, how many phone calls we made, the amount of people we were able to speak to. But from an overall narrative, it did not help.
Okay. I'm going to go to the Trump campaign. What was your reaction to this announcement?
It was certainly looked at as I guess as positive, and I hear everything Jennifer's saying, all logical, it makes sense. But then you look at the actual map, Trump was going to win all of Romney states, I thought all along, including North Carolina, and based on some numbers we had, et cetera, I don't think it made a difference in Florida. And Iowa and Ohio, I think, were so big in our camp, the Comey letter made no difference. So the question is, for Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, did that letter make the difference of 10 or 50 or 70,000 votes? Again, I think what Jennifer says makes sense. I'd like to see the data to back that up, and maybe John has some data to counter what I just said. But I just think it didn't have as big an impact because when you get down to the numbers, we were winning those red states, we were winning Romney states, plus Iowa and Ohio. So it came down to those other three.
I'd say before, and Alan definitely reflects what was going on in the campaign and with our people
on the ground. But actually, we were moving up all week before the letter. And what was different was the WikiLeaks story, because like early on, if you ask people, you know, does Hillary Clinton lie? Sure, they said yes. But it doesn't affect them. But the corruption stories, if it could flip over and it could be about corruption from the Clinton Foundation, because the email server kind of like, you know, just stood in place at some point. It's like, okay, she had this own email server. So people weren't saying that was really bad. But the new information was the stories were coming out about Clinton donors getting deals with the State Department and other things. And that happened before the Comey letter. And I have no idea, none of us probably have any idea what happened inside the Justice Department, inside the FBI, that precipitated him doing this. And that's probably the real story that neither campaign knows. But all of a sudden he says, and we had heard that that Clinton Foundation investigation was still going on, and even when he said it was closed and all that. And that to us, that was the real corruption that would actually, people would say, we've had enough of this, we've known her for 25 years. Among our supporters, you get stuff like, you know, this was, it goes back to the Travelgate, whatever gate, different things that went on in the Clinton administration, the pardons, all that kind of stuff. There was an element during the week as the WikiLeaks stories came out about the Clinton Foundation and that corruption. You could see voters saying, we've had independent voters coming to us saying we've had enough of this. And there was a grinding vote up. And then when the letter hit, like that weekend, I was actually in the field in New York for the New York State Republican Party, a statewide poll, just to see if they had a shot. And all of a sudden, you know, talking to Carl Palladino, I'm like, Carl, you really ran the poll at the right time. How'd you know the letter was coming out? We had no clue. But the poll comes back, we're only down 11 in New York, and I'm like, that's not going to hold. But it was just a reflection of what had happened on. So we tracked up all that week. The letter hits, it's like throwing a match on gasoline. So we're back in the race. The troops are energized. People are seeing there's a path to victory. You could tell from the appearances Kellyanne on TV, and you could see the you could see the rallies on the ground that Mike was at with Mr. Trump. That energy was there, so it definitely was catalyzed. But we were asking a question in all the tracking surveys, which is the more important factor, Donald Trump's temperament or Hillary Clinton's corruption? And during the week, it shifted to Hillary Clinton's corruption, and that letter then reinforced that. And in the battleground states from then on till the end of the campaign, it was about her corruption, knowing that was the big character contrast, and it wasn't our temperament. It was the idea that they didn't want any more corruption. So,
I think what you just said on that, which ties into the Comey letter, actually reinforces the fact that it did hurt us. And you know, when we looked at our data going into it, first of all, I agree with you on Ohio and Iowa. We knew, you know, a month out, those are going to be really hard states for us to be successful in. Florida was always tight. We could have a great week in the press. We were up 1 or 2 in Florida. You guys could have a great week. Same, you know. So Florida was always tight. North Carolina, we knew we were playing to win North Carolina, but that's a state that was harder for us. And then you have the Rust Belt, and I would say Pennsylvania, Michigan, and to an extent Wisconsin, always, those were kind of your states that moved a lot more, right? And so there was the natural tightening, and then, you know, you have the 10-day span where this is just in the press, and you just saw it tighten more than I think we were expecting. So I guess we can agree to disagree, or somewhat agree, all agree, whatever. I do think it made a difference where you're at the very end, and then what we've seen in some of the data so far is people who made up their mind last minute went for Trump. And if you were, people made up their minds for the last week, went for Trump. And if you have, that's your narrative for our campaign going to the last week.
Yeah, there were 2 other factors I see. By the way, when Comey said, oops, we didn't mean to send that letter or whatever he did, there wasn't much campaign polling going on inside our campaign, but we had other people who were doing it at the last minute. And you can see there was a little bit of help for her then. But the other states, a lot of these states that came into play, and by the way, when we were, you know, we're sitting there and we're trying to tell the senior team, like, we got to go to Michigan, it's close. You got to go to Pennsylvania, it's close. And you know, Donald Trump did it. He believed it right off the bat. So he's going in. When you guys came right after us, I'm like, they must be seeing the same polls. And it wasn't, at that point, it wasn't just because we were also playing to get a turnout of people who don't usually come out, that may have skipped the election, that, you know, we needed an extra turnout in these states.
the economic messages, like in Ohio, we were running a message about jobs and trade in coal mining areas and stuff like that, and wasn't the corruption thing, it was basically their situation. And how Donald Trump, it's so ironic. Here you got this billionaire who's fighting for these average working people, and it was resonating. And you could see that playing in the last week as well in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And but there was an economic message as well as a character message that was playing to our advantage in that last week.
The going into Election Day, the media seemed to, at least most of the coverage I saw, seemed to indicate that Secretary Clinton would win. There were some reports even late in the afternoon on Election Day that Trump sources were telling the media that they hoped to put up a good showing, but that they had no anticipation of winning the election. So I'm curious, what was the real attitude inside both campaigns? What did you really think on Election Day before you saw the numbers coming maybe in from some of the key states?
Thought we were going to win. Yeah, it's not a secret. Yeah, we went in. Look, we knew some of the states tightened. Again, I'll just go back to something what I was just saying a second ago. We knew Iowa and Ohio would be tough. We knew Florida would be close. I think if we, were guessing going into election day, I thought we would eke out Florida. We knew North Carolina would be tough and probably would end up not being successful there. And then again, you had the Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. I think we were feeling pretty good about PA and Wisconsin in particular, even though they both in the last 10 days really started to take the hit. And Michigan always was a little bit of that. And then just going back to like overall strategy, I think this goes into what Sasha was saying earlier. There was a lot of talk in the media about, oh, she's going to Michigan, she's trying to shore it up. There was many times we didn't go somewhere because we didn't want to attract you guys to going to that place, right? And Michigan is a good example. We knew that message and what you all were talking about could really work into Michigan because we saw what the electorate looked like. And so if we all of a sudden just went into Michigan, signal, maybe Trump wants to go into Michigan. So part of this was just the kind of chess pieces of where you go, when you go, et cetera. But we saw it tighten at the end, so we went, and it was election day only state. But I think going into it, look, we felt that we would, no big landslide, but we would come out successful and get to 270 electoral votes.
Can I just follow up and ask, at what point did the alarm bells start going off? I mean, at what point did you start to realize things were not as they seemed?
I think you guys should chime in too. Florida was one of the first states to come in, and we lost Florida, and I think that was a warning sign, right? Then the question was, okay, is that something that's a little bit off, or is that going to be a trend? I think Virginia was, we knew Virginia, the way they count votes, you're going to have some of the rural and areas coming in first, and so you're going to be down, and then slowly you're going to come back. So we saw, the DC suburbs starting to come in. We started to move back, but not as big a margin as we were expecting. And so then things were starting to get a little bit, okay, what is that going to mean for these Rust Belt states? And, once Pennsylvania started getting counted, because that was on the East Coast, so it closed earlier, we knew there was a chance that this wouldn't work out.
Okay. Trump campaign, what did you guys actually feel going into Election Day, and at what point did you believe, did you think you had a chance to win? Did you think you were going to win, or did you think you had a chance?
I thought we had a chance. I'll mention, I was in the Trump Tower in the headquarters. Michael was on the trail, and we might have different atmospheres going on. I think most people in the HQ thought we had a shot. I still have this text. My wife texted me, what do you think, what are your chances? I said 50-50. This is the morning of. A lot of things have to happen the right way, but I was confident in Florida, North Carolina, so that means you've got to get some combination. You had the one electoral vote in Maine, Colorado, and Nevada were still possible, although I was not optimistic about Nevada because of early voting. So I think most of the people in Trump Tower and the HQ were, let's say, 30 to 50, a little over 50%, maybe 50, maybe it was 50, maybe that was the max, but there was certainly, it was not this Huffington Post 99% chance business. Nobody in the headquarters thought that.
Yeah, I'll add to that too. Brad Parscale's been mentioned a couple of times here, who is among many roles he had was managing our data. And he had felt very confident a few days before that about our chances for victory, and he had said so, that he felt very strongly based on some of the data he was seeing that, we were going to carry these states that nobody else expected. So I'm, throughout this campaign, my reaction to events are much more visceral than they are data-driven, which may be heresy for many here, but that's just how I experienced it, probably because I had spent so much time on the campaign trail just seeing, the reaction that he got from our events, which, again, this campaign, unlike any other, was event-driven from the beginning. That created our momentum, the excitement, the earned media was all driven off these events. And we, in essence, from that perspective, it was a general election the whole time. So anyway, to what Alan said, we felt very strongly as we were traveling that we had the momentum and that we could win, just based on, the feeling we were and the energy we were getting from the people that we were seeing.
Okay, I want to conclude this as quickly as I can so we can go to our lunch break. But did anyone else on the panel who were not associated with the campaigns see anything other than what I would kind of state as the conventional wisdom, which was that Secretary Clinton was going to win?
By the way, just for a footnote, I had a conference call on Friday with Tony and Adam Geller and Mike Basilise, and we all thought there was definitely a path for us to win, and we thought it was a really good place to go. Brad was definitely thought we were going to win, and I was like, it's all going to come down to turnout on Tuesday. And during the day, I thought the exit polls, just like a lot of media polls that we're hearing reports of, we don't actually see them. And I didn't go over to the tower because I want to be someplace. I used to work for CBS Radio, looking at the exit polls and analyzing them. And there was always a bias among the decision desks that they get a herd mentality. And when I was getting the reports that day, by coincidence, I had to do a 4 o'clock briefing for the foreign press because I did it 2 years before in Manhattan. And I was like, the exit polls are going to be wrong because they got some of the wrong models and because of the data that we'd seen. And I was telling that to our own team during the day, like I was emailing Steve and Kellyanne and everybody and the other pollsters. I'm like, I got a feeling these exit polls, not so much by Mary or their team, but by the people in the networks. Because during that night, they held off calling states that we were ahead, that we thought we were going to win. And I'm like, they're playing a game. And I saw this back, Chris Lahane, where, I've been on the receiving end of calls, make this call, make that call. And I'm like, they're holding out on Georgia. They're holding out. Eventually, we'd go ahead in Florida, like Virginia was going to go the other way. And it's because Nevada and Colorado and these other states are still voting. And people were thinking, oh, she's going to win. And at some point, it got to the point where I'm emailing Steve, and I'm saying, send, Mr. Trump down. And they're holding off on making these calls, but send him down. And, after they call Florida, maybe send him down, things look good or whatever, because it's going to be 6 in the morning by the time they call these things. And they should be calling them earlier. And Steve, emails me back if they call Pennsylvania. Finally, AP called Pennsylvania. He sent Mr. Trump down. But it was, just like that. You saw one extreme 2 weeks out, and you saw ABC had a poll that was plus 12 Democrat. And they're saying we're losing. And it's plus 12 when you adjust it to plus 6 even, that where Hillary was. We were in a dead heat. Mm-hmm. So it's like some of these models were just, they were based on an assumption of 2012 that 2016 was going to be just like 2012, and it wasn't. So.
Okay, Nate Silver's last set of odds the morning of Election Day, he basically said Trump had a 1 in 3. Anybody else on the panel thought that Trump had a better than 1 in 3 chance? Anybody? Well, I know you did. I said anyone else.
I think as a pollster and someone who follows the polls, and someone who really thinks that these polling aggregators like Nate Silver has come up with are really neat and summarize all the polls, because an individual poll can be flawed or an individual poll can be biased, but when you combine them all, there's a lot more power to it. But it did make me uncomfortable as a pollster to go to the New York Times webpage or go particularly, so Nate Silver was the most conservative, but particularly to go to the New York Times website at certain points in the campaign, particularly September, and see that Clinton had an 85 and at times 89% chance of winning. And that made me feel very uncomfortable because I felt that was misrepresenting what the polls can tell us. And the New York Times, to its credit, did a piece on probability and how people we can't assess probability that rationally. It's difficult for us to understand chances and what that really means. And so they did a piece about, Clinton's, Donald Trump's chance of winning was about the chance of a kicker kicking a field goal from 35 yards, about the same chance as them missing that field goal. And so I thought that was like an illustrative way to explain it, but that particular piece probably was read by lots of data nerds like me, but wasn't read by the public, who would just go to Nate Silver or go to the New York Times and say, ooh, 95% or 85% chance of winning, 79% chance of winning, and then close the browser and go on to the next thing. And so it'll be interesting to see, I think, how the polling industry reacts, and maybe we'll take down the big banner that says, these are the odds for this particular candidate.
Okay, we're going to conclude this session. We're going to restart our next session in 45 minutes. Sorry, we're running out of time. I'm going to try to save some time for audience Q&A, but please thank our panelists for the discussion this morning. It's been really compelling.